Hello, my friends. I hope you're all doing well. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for your amazing support and for being here. It truly means a lot to me. If you enjoy this video, let's see if we can reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments together. Your support helps this channel grow and motivates me to keep bringing you more terrifying horror stories. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy today's story. Now let's begin. The transfer papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, coffee-stained and crumpled from their journey through 3 different ranger stations. I'd been expecting them for weeks, ever since I'd put in for the remote posting at Wakatoma National Forest. Most rangers avoided the assignment. Too isolated, they said, too far from civilization. But after 5 years of dealing with drunk campers and trash-strewn picnic areas near the interstate, I craved the solitude. Wakatoma stretched across northwestern Montana, 847,000 acres of old-growth forest that hadn't seen proper logging since the 1890s. The name came from the Blackfoot people who'd lived there centuries ago, though the exact translation varied depending on who you asked. Some said it meant place where the wind speaks. Others claimed it was forest of long shadows. The old-timer at the Kalispell station who processed my paperwork just shook his head when I asked. "Don't matter what it means," he'd said, stamping my forms without looking up. "Just matters that you come back." The drive took 11 hours from Kalispell, the last 4 on progressively worse roads. First the highway gave way to county roads, then gravel, then barely maintained dirt tracks that my truck struggled to navigate. By the time I reached Station 47, my new home for the next year, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the forest in shades of copper and blood. The station consisted of a main cabin, a storage shed, and a radio tower that looked like it hadn't been upgraded since the Carter administration. The previous ranger, a woman named Rodriguez, had left 2 weeks early. Her notes were minimal: supply schedules, radio frequencies, trail conditions. Nothing about why she'd broken her contract to leave. I spent my first week getting oriented. The territory I was responsible for covered roughly 200 square miles of the most remote section of Wakatoma. My duties were straightforward: maintain trails, monitor wildlife, assist any hikers or campers who wandered this far into the wilderness, and report anything unusual to the main ranger station 80 miles south. The isolation hit differently than I'd expected. I'd wanted solitude, but Wakatoma delivered something else entirely. The forest was never truly quiet. Branches creaked, wind moaned through the canopy, things moved in the underbrush, but underneath it all was a quality of stillness that seemed to press against my eardrums. At night, when I turned off my generator to save fuel, the darkness was absolute. No light pollution, no distant highway sounds, just the forest and whatever moved through it. My patrol routes took me deep into the territory. The trails were well marked but little used. In my first 2 weeks, I encountered exactly 3 groups of hikers, all experienced backcountry enthusiasts who seemed surprised to find a ranger this far out. They signed my log, accepted my warnings about water sources and weather patterns, and continued on their way. It was during my 3rd week that I found the first sign something was wrong. I was checking the northeastern boundary, where Wakatoma butted up against private land. The trail wound through a grove of ancient Douglas firs, their trunks so massive that it would take 6 people holding hands to encircle them. The forest floor here was carpeted in moss and fallen needles, muffling my footsteps. The smell hit me first, a thick, cloying sweetness like overripe fruit mixed with something medicinal. I followed my nose off the trail, pushing through ferns that reached my chest. About 50 yards in, I found the source. A bull elk lay in a small clearing, or what remained of one. The carcass had been opened with surgical precision, the rib cage splayed wide like wings. The organs were gone, but there was almost no blood on the ground. The head was missing entirely, severed so cleanly that the vertebrae looked polished. I'd seen plenty of predator kills. Bears were messy, leaving claw marks and scattered remains. Wolves worked as a pack, consuming what they could and caching the rest. Mountain lions went for the neck and dragged their prey to cover. This was none of those things. I photographed the scene and marked the GPS coordinates. Back at the station, I reviewed my images on the laptop, zooming in on the severed neck. The cut was impossibly clean, as if made by a blade, but no human hunter would waste an entire elk, and poachers didn't operate this deep in the forest. I filed my report and tried to push down the unease crawling up my spine. The forest did strange things to people who spent too much time alone. Rodriguez had lasted 8 months before leaving early. The ranger before her, according to the records I'd found, had made it only 6. 2 nights later, I woke to the motion sensor lights outside the cabin flaring to life. I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the window, but the harsh white glare of the LEDs created a wall of light that made it impossible to see beyond. After 5 minutes, they clicked off. Nothing moved in the darkness beyond. I found the tracks the next morning. They circled the cabin in a perfect loop, staying just at the edge of where the motion lights would trigger. The prints were wrong. They looked almost like bare human feet, but elongated, with what seemed like claw marks at the tips of the toes. The stride length suggested something walking upright, something tall. I measured, photographed, and made casts of the clearest prints. The plaster captured details that made my skin crawl. The tracks showed dermal ridges like a human foot, but the proportions were all wrong. The arch was too high, the toes too long, and those claw marks. I spent the rest of the day installing additional cameras around the station, modern trail cams that could record in infrared. Whatever had circled my cabin, I wanted to see it coming next time. That night, I sat at my desk, updating my logs and trying to make sense of what I'd found. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Bears walking upright occasionally, the tracks distorted by morning dew, my imagination running wild in the isolation. But my gut knew better. Something was moving through Wakatoma, something that walked like a man but wasn't one. I radioed the main station, reporting the tracks and requesting guidance. The dispatcher, a bored-sounding kid named Matthews, took my information and promised someone would review it. No one called back. 3 days passed without incident. I continued my patrols, checked my cameras, maintained the trails. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Even the usual wildlife was scarce. No deer at the salt licks, no birdsong at dawn, just the endless whisper of wind through branches. On the 4th night, the cameras captured something. The first images showed nothing unusual. The empty clearing around my cabin, infrared rendering everything in shades of gray. Then, at 2:47 a.m., a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. It stood upright, tall enough that its head nearly reached the 8-foot mark I'd placed on a tree for reference. The image was grainy, but I could make out what looked like fur, or possibly tattered clothing hanging from its frame. It stood there for 3 images, about 9 seconds based on the camera's interval setting, then vanished. Not walked away, not ran. In one frame it was there, in the next, gone. I reviewed the other cameras. 2 of them had been turned to face the ground, their mounting straps intact but loosened. The third showed nothing. Whatever had visited didn't want to be seen clearly. I barely slept the rest of the night, sitting in my kitchen with my service weapon on the table and every light in the cabin burning. When dawn finally came, I ventured out to examine the area where the figure had stood. The ground was undisturbed. No tracks, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to indicate something that large had been there. But caught on a low branch, I found something that made my blood run cold. A strip of what looked like dried skin, but wrong somehow. Like it had come from something between animal and human. I sealed it in an evidence bag, my hands shaking. This was beyond my training, beyond anything the Forest Service had prepared me for. But I had a job to do, and running wasn't an option. Not yet. That afternoon, I drove my truck to the highest point in my territory where I could sometimes get cell signal. I needed to research, to understand what I might be dealing with. The connection was weak, but I managed to pull up some articles about the history of Wakatoma. The Blackfoot had abandoned the area in the 1850s, decades before white settlers arrived. The few historical accounts I found mentioned evil that wears the skin of beasts and warnings about things that hunted in the deep forest. One anthropologist's paper from the 1970s described legends of creatures that could take the shape of animals but walked as men. Beings that existed between worlds, skinwalkers. The word came unbidden to my mind, though the legends I'd heard usually placed them in the Southwest, not the forests of Montana. But indigenous peoples had traveled, traded, shared stories. Perhaps some darkness had taken root here, in the shadows of Wakatoma. As the sun set, I made my decision. I would stay, would document whatever was happening here. Rodriguez had run. The ranger before her had run. But someone had to face whatever stalked these woods, and apparently that someone was me. I drove back to the station as darkness fell, my headlights cutting through the gathering gloom. The forest pressed in on both sides of the dirt road, and I could swear I saw shapes moving between the trees, keeping pace with my truck. When I reached the cabin, I parked close to the door and moved quickly inside. The motion lights flared, then died. In the darkness beyond their reach, something waited. The call came in at dawn, crackling through the ancient radio system with bursts of static. 2 hikers had gone missing near Crow's Eye Lake, the most remote body of water in my sector. Their friends had made it to the Southern Ranger Station and reported them overdue by 2 days. I loaded my pack with search and rescue gear, extra batteries for the GPS, and my rifle. The standard protocol was to carry bear spray and a sidearm, but after the past week's events, I wanted more firepower. The trip to Crow's Eye Lake would take me deeper into Wakatoma than I'd ventured yet, into the old-growth forest where the trees grew so thick that noon felt like twilight. The trail started well-maintained but deteriorated quickly. By the time I'd hiked 4 miles, I was following game paths and blazes carved into bark decades ago. The forest here felt different, older, heavier. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by the creak of ancient wood and the whisper of wind through needles. I found their camp by smell before sight. The sweet, sick odor I'd encountered with the elk carcass hung in the air, but mixed with something else, wood smoke and fierce sweat. The campsite sat on a small rise overlooking Crow's Eye Lake, a perfectly circular body of water that local legends claimed was bottomless. The tent stood intact but empty. Sleeping bags lay unzipped inside, as if the occupants had left in a hurry. A Coleman stove sat on a flat rock with a pot of water that had long since boiled away, leaving a black residue. No signs of struggle, no blood, just absence. I photographed everything and began a systematic search of the area. Their packs were still here, wallets and phones in the side pockets. Whatever had happened, they hadn't planned to leave. The phones were dead, probably from the cold, but I bagged them as evidence. Circling the campsite, I found the tracks. 2 sets of hiking boots heading toward the lake, moving fast based on the stride length. Following them was that same elongated print I'd found at my cabin, but clearer here in the soft earth near the water. The thing had been pursuing them. The tracks led to the lake's edge and stopped. Just stopped, as if all 3 had vanished into thin air. I stood at the shoreline, scanning the water. Crow's Eye Lake was notorious for its clarity. You could see down 30 feet or more on a calm day. Today, the water was black as oil, reflecting nothing. I called out, my voice echoing across the water. "Park Service. If anyone can hear me, respond." The forest swallowed my words without even an echo. Setting up a search grid, I spent hours combing the shoreline. No bodies floating, no gear washed up, no signs they'd entered the water, but I found other things. Trees with claw marks 8 feet up the trunk, a deer skull placed carefully on a flat rock like an altar, and everywhere, that sweet sick smell growing stronger as the day wore on. By afternoon, I'd covered a mile of shoreline in each direction. The missing hikers, Jake Morrison and Beth Chan according to their IDs, were simply gone. But I'd found something else that made my skin crawl. The structure stood back in the trees, maybe 50 yards from the water. At first glance, it looked like a hunting blind, but closer inspection revealed something far stranger. Built from woven branches and what looked like sinew, it formed a rough shelter about 7 feet tall. Inside, the ground was covered in pelts, deer, elk, and other fur I couldn't immediately identify. On the walls, someone or something had used charcoal and what might have been blood to draw symbols. They weren't Native American. I'd studied enough petroglyphs to know that. These were something else. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they were trying to convey meaning my mind couldn't process. In the center of the shelter sat a pile of bones, cleaned and sorted by type. Human finger bones mixed with deer ribs. A bear skull topped the pile, but modified. Holes had been drilled through the cranium in a precise pattern. I backed out slowly, my hand on my weapon. This wasn't some hermit's camp or a poacher's hideout. This was something ritualistic, something that spoke to intelligence but not human intelligence. Not anymore. The sun was getting low, and I had a decision to make. Protocol said to return to the station, call in a full search team, let others handle this. But those hikers might still be alive somewhere, and every hour counted in a rescue situation. I made camp upwind from the shelter, choosing a defensive position with good sightlines. As darkness fell, I built my fire larger than usual, banking it to last through the night. The smoke would announce my presence to anything out there, but I needed the light more than stealth. The first sounds came around midnight. Footsteps circling my camp, just beyond the firelight. They moved wrong, too quick, with odd pauses between steps. I sat with my back to a large pine, rifle across my knees, scanning the darkness. "Jake? Beth?" I called out. "This is Ranger Harrison with the Park Service. If you can hear me, come toward the fire." The footsteps stopped. Then, from somewhere off to my left, came a perfect imitation of my voice. "This is Ranger Harrison with the Park Service." My blood turned to ice. The words were exact, but the tone was wrong, like someone had recorded my voice and played it back through damaged speakers. I gripped my rifle tighter and stayed silent. The mimicry continued, using my voice to call out variations of what I'd said. Then it started using other voices, a woman crying for help, a man screaming in pain, a child laughing, all coming from different directions, trying to draw me away from the fire. I held my position through the night, feeding the fire and ignoring the voices. Near dawn, they stopped abruptly, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest waking up. Birds sang again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. When full daylight came, I investigated the area around my camp. The tracks were everywhere, that same elongated print, but also others. Some looked like wolf paws, but far too large. Others resembled bear, but with opposable digits, as if something was changing shape, trying on different forms. I made one more sweep of the lake area, calling for the missing hikers. The only response was the wind sighing through the pines. Finally, I had to admit defeat. I marked the GPS coordinates of the shelter and the campsite, packed up the hikers' phones and wallets, and began the long hike back. The journey out felt different than the trip in. I had the constant sensation of being watched, followed. Twice I spun around, certain something was directly behind me, but the trail was always empty. The forest seemed to press closer, branches catching at my pack, roots trying to trip me. 5 miles from the station, I found a message, carved into the bark of a tree directly across the trail, in letters 2 feet high. Leave. The carving was fresh, sap still oozing from the wounds in the bark. I photographed it and kept moving, but my pace quickened. Whatever was out there, it was becoming bolder. I reached the station as the sun touched the horizon. My hands shook as I unlocked the door, and I had to resist the urge to barricade myself inside immediately. First, I had to report in. The radio crackled to life, and I gave my report to the dispatcher. 2 hikers still missing, evidence of something unusual at the scene, requesting immediate backup and a full search team. The dispatcher took the information professionally, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice when I described the shelter and the mimicry. "We'll send a team in the morning," she said finally, weather permitting. I checked the forecast. A storm system was moving in from the Pacific, bringing heavy rain and possibly snow to the higher elevations. Morning might be too late. That night, I uploaded all my photos and recordings to the cloud, using the satellite internet connection. If something happened to me, at least there would be a record. I also wrote a detailed report of everything I'd experienced since arriving at Wakatama, emailing it to my supervisor and my sister back in Oregon. The motion lights triggered 6 times during the night. Each time, I watched through the window but saw nothing. The cameras I checked in the morning told a different story. The images showed the same tall figure from before, but clearer now. It stood at the edge of the light, and in the improved resolution, I could make out details that made me wish I couldn't. The proportions were human enough to be recognizable but wrong enough to be revolting. 2 long arms ended in hands that were more claw than finger. The face, I couldn't process the face. It seemed to shift between frames, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to look like. In the last image, it held something up toward the camera. I zoomed in, my stomach dropping as I recognized what it was showing me. A driver's license. Beth Chen's driver's license. The search and rescue team never made it. The storm that rolled in that morning brought 2 feet of snow to the high country, and winds that grounded the helicopters. The access roads became impassable mudslides. For 3 days, I was cut off completely, even the radio crackling with nothing but static. I used the time to research. The satellite internet worked sporadically, giving me windows to dig into the history of Wakatoma and similar incidents elsewhere. What I found made me wish I'd stayed ignorant. Disappearances in the forest went back over a century. The official records blamed bears, exposure, and getting lost, but the unofficial accounts told different stories. Hunters who returned speaking of things that walked upright but weren't human. Entire logging camps abandoned overnight with no explanation. A geological survey team in 1952 that radioed about hostile wildlife before vanishing completely. The indigenous accounts were more explicit. The Blackfoot name for this area wasn't actually Wakatoma. That was a sanitized version for the maps. The real name translated to something like the place where shapes lose meaning, or where the skin walks separate from the soul. The last Blackfoot to live here had left in 1847, and their oral histories said they'd sealed something in the forest before they went. I found an anthropologist field notes from 1971, Dr. Patricia Whitehorse, who'd interviewed elders about the legends. Her notes mentioned rituals designed to contain something that existed between animal and man, between flesh and spirit. The elders had refused to speak about it directly, but one had drawn symbols that looked disturbingly similar to what I'd seen in the shelter by Crow's Eye Lake. Dr. Whitehorse had disappeared during a solo camping trip in Wakatama in 1973. On the second night of the storm, something tested the cabin's defenses. I woke to the sound of scratching on the walls, starting low and moving upward. It circled the entire structure, pausing at windows and the door. When it reached the roof, footsteps paced back and forth for hours. Heavy footsteps that made the rafters creak. I sat in the kitchen with every light on, my rifle loaded with rounds I'd modified. silver crosses filed into the tips. I wasn't particularly religious, but I figured it couldn't hurt. The pacing above continued until dawn, then stopped abruptly. When the storm cleared enough for me to venture outside, I found no tracks in the fresh snow. Nothing on the roof, no sign of how something had gotten up there or down. But carved into the door, through the heavy wood and into the metal reinforcement beneath, were 4 words: "You cannot hide forever." The radio came back online that afternoon. The rescue team would arrive the next morning, weather permitting. I gave them precise coordinates for the missing hikers' campsite and the shelter, but I didn't mention my recent visitors. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? That night brought revelations that changed everything. I was reviewing the trail cam footage again when I noticed something in the background of one image. A second figure, smaller and partially hidden behind trees. I enhanced it as much as the software allowed and felt my heart stop. It was Beth Chen, or something wearing her shape. She stood naked despite the cold, her skin wrong somehow, too loose, as if it didn't quite fit. Her face was turned toward the camera, and her expression was blank, puppet-like. But her eyes reflected the infrared light like an animal's. I checked the timestamp. This was taken 2 nights after she'd disappeared, 30 miles from Crow's Eye Lake. No human could have covered that distance in that time. Not through this terrain, not naked in near-freezing temperatures. The final piece fell into place when I found Rodriguez's hidden files. She'd encrypted them, but left the password on a sticky note in a survival manual. Get out 2023. Inside were her real reports, the ones she hadn't filed with the service. Rodriguez had encountered the same things I had, but she'd dug deeper. She'd found references to a government program from the 1950s, something called Project Switchback. Military experiments in biological plasticity and consciousness transfer conducted in remote locations. Wakatama had been one of the test sites. The project had been terminated in 1959 after what the redacted documents called a containment breach. All personnel were evacuated. The site was abandoned and the area was transferred to the Forest Service with strict instructions to limit human access. But something had stayed behind. Something that had learned to wear shapes like clothes, to mimic voices, to hunt with intelligence that was almost but not quite human. The Blackfoot had known about it, had tried to contain it. The military had studied it, tried to control it, and failed. Rodriguez's final entry was dated 3 days before she'd left. It's learning faster now. It took Sarah's shape yesterday, spoke to me with her voice. Sarah's been dead for 3 years. I think it can access memories somehow, pull faces from the minds of those it encounters. I'm leaving tomorrow. Whoever reads this, don't stay. It's not worth your life. A sound outside made me look up from the laptop. Through the window I saw them. 5 figures standing at the edge of the motion lights range. Jake and Beth were there, along with 3 others I didn't recognize. All naked despite the cold, all with that same puppet-like blankness to their features. They stood in a perfect line, unmoving, just watching the cabin. I grabbed my camera and managed to get several shots before they turned in unison and walked backward into the forest. Not turned around, walked backward, their heads rotating to keep facing me until they disappeared into the darkness. I spent the rest of the night preparing. If the rescue team made it in tomorrow, I'd hand over everything. My reports, Rodriguez's files, all the evidence. Let someone else, someone with resources and backup, deal with whatever was happening here. My job was just to survive until then. But as dawn approached, I heard helicopters in the distance. The sound grew louder, closer, then abruptly cut off. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. An hour later, I saw smoke rising from the direction of the landing zone I'd cleared. Black, oily smoke that climbed straight up in the still air. I tried the radio, calling for the rescue team. No response. I faced a choice. Protocol said to stay at the station, wait for backup. But those might be survivors out there, and every minute counted. I loaded my pack with medical supplies, ammunition, and Rodriguez's external drive containing all our evidence. If I didn't make it back, maybe someone would find it. The trip to the landing zone took an hour through snow. I moved carefully, stopping frequently to listen and watch. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, even the ever-present whisper of wind absent. I smelled it before I saw it. That sweet, sick odor mixed with aviation fuel and burned metal. The helicopter lay on its side in the clearing, the rotors sheared off, the fuselage crumpled like paper. No bodies inside or around it, no blood, just like the hikers' campsite. But there were tracks, dozens of them, all different types, human, bear, wolf, and things that didn't match any animal I knew. They led away from the wreck in all directions, as if whatever had been here had split up to cover more ground. I followed the clearest set, boot prints from one of the rescue team. They led deeper into the forest, toward an area I'd never explored. The prints were joined by others, those elongated barefoot tracks keeping pace beside them. 2 miles in, the tracks ended at another structure. This one was larger than the shelter at Crow's Eye Lake, almost a building. It was made from the same woven branches and sinew, but reinforced with metal scavenged from somewhere. Old Forest Service signs, pieces of abandoned equipment. Inside, I found horrors that still visit my dreams. The rescue team was there, all 4 of them. But they weren't dead. They sat in a circle, their eyes open but vacant, their mouths moving in unison as they whispered something in a language that predated words. Their skin rippled and shifted as I watched, as if something beneath was trying to find the right fit. In the center of their circle sat something that might once have been human. It was ancient, desiccated, more mummy than man, but its eyes were alert, intelligent, and when they fixed on me I felt my mind crack just a little. It spoke without moving its lips, the words appearing directly in my thoughts. "You brought them to us. Fresh shapes, fresh memories. We are grateful." I raised my rifle, but my hands wouldn't obey. The thing's will pressed against mine, trying to force me to my knees. I fought back, focusing on my training, my duty, my fury at what this thing had done. The silver-tipped round took its center mass. The creature screamed, not with its mouth but with the voices of everyone it had ever taken. The sound was visible, a ripple in the air that knocked me backward. The rescue team collapsed like cut strings. The structure began to shake, branches unweaving, the whole thing coming apart. I grabbed the nearest team member, a young woman with Chen on her name tape, and dragged her outside as the shelter imploded. She was breathing but unconscious. So were the others when I checked. Whatever hold the creature had on them was broken, but I could hear sounds in the forest, angry sounds, multiple somethings moving fast through the underbrush. I triggered my emergency beacon and fired 3 shots in the air, the universal signal for distress. Then I set about creating a defensive position, dragging the unconscious team members into a tight circle, building a fire with accelerant from the helicopter's supplies. They came as the sun set. Not the puppets wearing human faces, but the real things, shapes that flowed between forms, sometimes bipedal, sometimes on all 4s, always wrong. They circled us, testing the edges of the firelight, retreating when I fired warning shots. I was down to my last magazine when I heard the helicopters. Real ones this time, the heavy thrum of military Blackhawks. Searchlights pierced the canopy, and rappel lines dropped soldiers in hazmat gear. The creatures fled, moving faster than anything that size should. A few soldiers pursued, but most focused on us. A medic checked the rescue team while another approached me. "Ranger Harrison?" His voice was muffled by the hazmat mask. "We're with U.S. Emerid. We'll take it from here. U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases. They weren't here for a rescue. They were here for containment. They evacuated us to a field hospital set up just outside the forest boundary. The rescue team was airlifted to a facility in Washington State, still unconscious but stable. I was kept for observation and debriefing, a polite way of saying interrogation. The officer in charge introduced himself as Colonel Marcus Webb. He was the kind of man who wore authority like body armor, every word measured, every gesture controlled. He set a digital recorder on the table between us and fixed me with gray eyes that had seen too much. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning." I talked for 3 hours. He didn't interrupt, didn't react, just listened as I described the events of the past month. When I finished, he leaned back and rubbed his temples. "You killed Dr. Whitehorse," he said finally. "The anthropologist. She disappeared in 1973, yes. What you shot in that structure was what remained of her, or rather, what she became." He pulled out a tablet and showed me classified documents. Project Switchback wasn't military. It was a joint operation with certain indigenous groups who had been containing these entities for centuries. Dr. Whitehorse volunteered to be a bridge, a translator between us and them. The documents told a different story than Rodriguez had found. The entities weren't extraterrestrial or supernatural. They were something older, a form of life that existed in the spaces between species, feeding on biological templates to maintain coherence in our reality. The Blackfoot called them shape thieves. Webb continued. They knew that killing them only scattered their essence, let them take new forms. The only way to contain them was to give them a stable host, someone who could channel their hunger into dormancy. Whitehorse volunteered for this. She was dying, cancer. She thought she could use her remaining time to keep these things contained. For 50 years it worked. She held them in check, fed them wildlife when necessary, kept them away from humans, but her body was failing. They needed new hosts. I thought of the rescue team, their vacant eyes, their synchronized whispers. So they take people, they copy people. The originals. He shrugged. We don't know. Maybe absorbed, maybe transported somewhere else. The copies can function for a while, even access memories. But they're just shells. Biological puppets. Then Jake and Beth? We'll search, but after this long. He didn't need to finish. Webb showed me satellite imagery of Wakatama. Heat signatures that didn't match any known wildlife. Moving in patterns that suggested intelligence. The military had been monitoring for years, maintaining the fiction of a remote forest while studying the entities. Why didn't you evacuate everyone? Close the forest and tell people what? That shape-shifting entities live in the woods? Besides, they were contained. 1 or 2 incidents per decade, always isolated, always explicable as animal attacks or exposure. Acceptable losses. Acceptable? I stood, anger burning through my exhaustion. Those were people. Hikers, hunters, rangers just doing their jobs. Sit down, Ranger Harrison. His voice carried the kind of authority that bypassed conscious thought. I sat. You think we're monsters, but we're the only thing standing between those entities and civilization. Do you know what would happen if they reached a population center? If they learned to mimic not just individuals but crowds? He showed me more files. Incident reports from around the world. A village in Siberia where everyone was found with their faces on backward. A research station in Antarctica where the personnel were discovered fused together into a single writhing mass. Always remote locations. Always contained before it could spread. Wakatama is one of 17 known convergence points, Webb explained. Places where these entities can maintain physical form. We monitor them all, contain what we can, eliminate what we can't. It's not perfect, but it works. And now we have a problem. Whitehorse's death, her true death, has destabilized the local population. They're actively hunting, trying to establish new hosts. We need someone who's encountered them and survived. Someone who understands the terrain. I saw where this was going. No, you've survived multiple encounters. You've shown resistance to their mental influence, and you know Wakatoma better than any active ranger. He pushed a contract across the table. Full military contractor status, hazard pay, support team on standby. All we need is someone on the ground, monitoring, reporting, and occasionally. He gestured at my rifle, which they'd returned to me cleaned and loaded, occasionally playing bait. Think of it as aggressive conservation. These entities are part of the ecosystem, like it or not. We just need to manage them. I read the contract. The money was more than I'd make in 10 years with the Forest Service. The equipment list included things I'd only dreamed of. Thermal drones, advanced communications, weapons that made my rifle look like a pop gun. But it was the last clause that caught my attention. Full disclosure authorization after a probationary period. 1 year maintaining containment, and you'll have clearance to access all files related to the entities. Maybe you'll find something we missed. Fresh eyes, different perspective. I thought about Jake and Beth, about all the names in the missing persons files, about Rodriguez running and the ranger before her, and all the ones who'd never made it out at all. Someone had to stand watch. Someone had to know. I signed. They kept me for another week, training me on equipment and protocols. I learned to recognize the signs of entity activity, temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic anomalies, the way birds fell silent in their presence. They taught me to use weapons loaded with rounds designed to disrupt their molecular cohesion, forcing them to abandon stolen forms. When I returned to Station 47, it had been transformed. New communications equipment, reinforced structures, and a basement that hadn't existed before. A safe house lined with materials the entities couldn't penetrate. The official story was upgraded facilities for wildlife research. My first night back, they came. I was ready this time. Motion sensors triggered a quarter-mile out, giving me time to prepare. I watched on thermal cameras as they approached, 6 figures moving in perfect synchronization, their heat signatures fluctuating wildly. They wore the faces of every person who'd gone missing in Wakatama over the past 5 years. Men, women, even a child who'd vanished on a camping trip, all walking with that same puppet-like gait, all focused on the station. I activated the sonic deterrence first. The entities recoiled from the frequency, their forms rippling like water, but they adapted quickly, changing their molecular structure to filter out the sound. Webb had warned me about this. They learned, evolved, overcame. When they reached the perimeter, I switched to the microwave emitters. The air shimmered as directed energy weapons heated the moisture in their bodies. 2 of them collapsed, their stolen forms melting like wax. But the others pressed forward. I retreated to the safe house as they breached the cabin above. Through the reinforced ceiling, I could hear them searching, their movements too quick, too fluid. They'd learned the layout from their previous visits. Then the whispers started, every voice I'd ever loved. My mother, dead 3 years. My ex-wife, somewhere in California. My sister, safe in Oregon, all calling to me, begging me to come out, to help them. The child's voice was the worst. High, scared, pleading for its parents. I put on the noise-canceling headphones and waited. The entities couldn't breach the safe house, but they didn't leave either. For 6 hours, they tested every surface, every seam, every possible weakness. I watched on the monitors as they flowed between forms, trying different shapes, different approaches. Near dawn, one of them did something new. It pressed against the camera, and for a moment, its stolen face became transparent. Beneath was something that my mind still struggles to process. Not a creature, not a thing, but a absence. A hungry void that wore shapes like masks, that existed only by consuming and mimicking life. It spoke, not with sound, but directly into the camera feed. Text appearing on my monitor. We remember you. We remember all of you. When the Watchers tire, when the Guardians fall, we will remain. Then they left, melting back into the forest as the sun rose. I emerged to find the cabin ransacked but intact. They'd taken things, photographs, clothing, anything with human scent or memory attached. Building their collection, Webb would later explain. Learning to be us, I filed my report and settled in for the long watch. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. I learned their patterns, their preferences. They avoided direct confrontation now, content to probe defenses and test boundaries. Sometimes I'd see them in the distance, wearing faces I recognized, going through the motions of human behavior. The worst was when they tried to be normal. I once observed 2 of them attempting to have a conversation, mimicking the cadence of human speech without understanding the meaning. They'd set up a mockery of a campsite, complete with a tent they didn't sleep in and a fire they didn't need, playing house with stolen lives. Other times, the forest would explode with activity. Every entity for miles would converge on a single point, writhing together in a mass that defied physics. These gatherings always preceded a disappearance somewhere else in Wakatoma. A hunter here, a thru-hiker there. They were coordinating, planning. 6 months in, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was reviewing thermal footage from one of these gatherings when I noticed a pattern. The entities weren't random in their movements, they were creating something. The writhing mass formed shapes, symbols that matched the ones from the shelter at Crow's Eye Lake. I cross-referenced with Dr. Whitehorse's notes and found her translation key. The symbols were a language, but not for communication. They were instructions, biological programming that shaped reality at a molecular level. The entities weren't just mimics, they were trying to become us, to overwrite our existence with their own. I sent the findings to Webb, who arrived within 12 hours with a full science team. They set up equipment around one of the gathering sites, waiting for the next convergence. When it came, they were ready. The lead scientist, Dr. Sarah Kim, explained it to me later. They're not individual entities, they're fragments of something larger, trying to reassemble themselves in our reality. Each host they take, each form they copy, is an attempt to build a bridge between their dimension and ours. Can we stop them? Stop them? No. But we might be able to redirect them. She showed me her calculations. If we can alter the symbolic language, change the instructions they're following, we might be able to make them less hostile, maybe even beneficial. It was a dangerous plan. One miscalculation and we could make them worse. But the alternative was an endless war of containment, watching them grow stronger and smarter with each passing year. We had our chance 3 weeks later. The final convergence began at midnight on the autumn equinox. Every monitoring station in Wakatama registered the movement. Dozens of entities flowing toward a central point deep in the oldest part of the forest. The trees there were ancient, predating human memory, their roots intertwined in patterns that mirrored neural networks. Dr. Kim's team had spent weeks preparing. They'd created their own symbols, carefully designed modifications to the entity's biological language. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Intercept the convergence, introduce the new programming, and hope we'd calculated correctly. I led the ground team, 6 soldiers in full hazmat gear, carrying equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. The forest fought us every step. Paths that should have been clear were overgrown. GPS units spun wildly, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of 100 yards. We heard it before we saw it. A sound like breathing, if breathing could shake the earth. The trees ahead glowed with bioluminescence, their bark pulsing with veins of light that hurt to look at directly. At the center of a natural amphitheater, the entities had gathered. There were more than we'd estimated. Hundreds of stolen forms writhed together in a pattern that challenged perception. I saw faces I recognized. Jake and Beth, the rescue team, rangers and hikers going back decades. All of them moving in perfect synchronization, building something with their bodies. It wasn't random writhing. They were constructing a doorway. The space between the trees began to tear, revealing something beyond that my mind refused to process. Not darkness, not light, but the absence of both. The void where the entities truly lived, where shape and form were meaningless concepts. Now, Dr. Kim's voice crackled through the radio. We deployed the emitters, surrounding the convergence with devices that projected the modified symbols. The entities reacted immediately, their forms rippling as the new instructions invaded their biological programming. Some collapsed, unable to reconcile the conflicting commands. Others split apart, revealing the hollowness beneath their stolen shapes. But the doorway kept growing. Through it came something that dwarfed the entities we'd been dealing with. Not a fragment, but a complete being from their dimension. It had no fixed form. One moment it was a towering mass of flesh and eyes, the next a geometric impossibility that existed in too many dimensions at once. It spoke with the voice of everyone it had ever consumed. "You dare rewrite us?" The ground shook. Trees that had stood for centuries toppled like matchsticks. One of the soldiers screamed as his hazmat suit began to melt, the material restructuring itself at a molecular level. I grabbed him and pulled him back as his weapon discharged wildly. "The symbols aren't holding," Dr. Kim shouted. "It's too strong." I thought of Dr. Whitehorse, holding these things in check for 50 years through sheer force of will. Of all the rangers who'd stood watch, all the people who'd sacrificed themselves to keep the darkness at bay, there had to be another way. The answer came from an unexpected source. My radio crackled with a transmission from Station 47, but the voice wasn't human. It was the synthesized speech of the AI system Webb's team had installed to monitor entity activity. "Ranger Harrison, I have been analyzing the biological language. The entities are not invaders, they are antibodies." "What?" "This dimension, our reality, is infected. The entities are attempting to cleanse it by replacing corrupted patterns with their own. Your presence, human presence, registers as the infection." I processed this as chaos erupted around me. 2 more soldiers down, their bodies twisting into impossible shapes. The doorway now occupied half the clearing, and through it more complete entities were emerging. How do we stop them? You don't. You prove you belong. The AI transmitted new symbols directly to my tactical display. Not modifications to their language, but something else entirely. A declaration, a biological signature that marked us as part of the ecosystem rather than foreign contaminants. I had seconds to decide. Trust an AI that had been learning from entities that copied and mimicked, or watch my team be consumed. "Dr. Kim, new pattern incoming." I forwarded the symbols to her equipment. She looked at them, her face paling behind her visor. This isn't containment. This is integration." "Do it." She reconfigured the emitters. The new symbols projected not at the entities but at us, rewriting our biological signatures at a quantum level. I felt it immediately, a sensation like ice water in my veins, my DNA itself shivering and reorganizing. The effect on the entities was instantaneous. They stopped moving, frozen in whatever form they'd taken. The massive being from beyond the doorway paused, its countless eyes focusing on us with something that might have been curiosity. Then it laughed. The sound was like reality tearing, but underneath was something almost human. "Finally," it said, "you understand." The doorway began to close, the entity withdrawing back to its dimension. As it went, the stolen forms began to move again, but differently. They weren't hunting now. They were dancing, celebrating. One by one, they shed their human shapes, revealing what they truly were beneath. Not monsters, not voids, but something beautifully alien. Creatures of pure biological potential, existing in the spaces between defined forms. They flowed around us, through us, and I felt their true nature. They were gardeners, reality gardeners, pruning diseased branches, replacing failed patterns with healthy ones. Earth had been marked for restructuring until we proved we could adapt, could change, could become part of the greater ecosystem rather than a cancer upon it. The integration wasn't without cost. 3 of the soldiers didn't survive the transformation, their bodies unable to accept the new programming. Dr. Kim aged 10 years in as many seconds, her hair going white as her cells rebuilt themselves. I felt my own changes, enhanced senses, an awareness of biological patterns I'd never noticed before, the ability to perceive the entity's true forms without madness. As dawn broke, the forest settled into a new equilibrium. The entities retreated but didn't leave. They took up residence in the spaces between trees, between thoughts, between heartbeats. Watching, waiting, ensuring the integration held. Webb arrived with the cleanup team to find us changed but alive. He took one look at our transformed states and nodded grimly. "So it's begun. You knew this would happen." We theorized. 17 convergence points worldwide, all showing increased activity. The entities weren't invading, they were preparing us. Earth is about to join a larger community, whether we're ready or not. The official story was a chemical spill, an experimental compound that caused hallucinations and temporary physiological changes. The families of Jake, Beth, and the others were told they died in a flash flood. Their bodies were never found because their bodies were never lost. They'd been transformed, integrated, made part of something larger. I returned to Station 47, but my job had changed. No longer was I containing the entities. I was facilitating communication. Others came, scientists and soldiers who underwent the integration, forming a new kind of ranger service. We learned their language, their purpose, their warnings about what was coming, because the entities were just the first wave. Earth was waking up, joining a cosmic ecosystem we'd never imagined, and we needed to be ready. The forest speaks to me now, not in words but in patterns, in the dance of molecules and the song of cellular division. Sometimes I see the old forms, a hiker who isn't quite right, a deer that walks on two legs, but I understand them now. They're not threats. They're teachers, showing us what we need to become to survive what's coming. Late at night, when the wind moves through the pines in just the right way, I can hear them all. Every person who ever entered Wakatoma and never left, every ranger who stood watch, every soul who paid the price for humanity's evolution. They're not gone. They're transformed, integrated into something beautiful and terrible. Dr. Whitehorse visits sometimes, wearing her original form but perfected, purified. She tells me about the worlds beyond, the civilizations that underwent their own integrations, the ones that succeeded and the ones that failed. Earth stands at a crossroads, she says. We can resist and be replaced, or adapt and ascend. I made my choice that night in the clearing. Now I help others make theirs. The integration isn't mandatory. Those who refuse are left alone, allowed to live their lives in the dwindling spaces between the new world and the old. But more choose to change, to become part of something greater than human. The missing hikers' families still call sometimes, hoping for news. I tell them what I can, that Jake and Beth are at peace, that they're part of something beautiful now. It's not a lie. I've seen them in the collective, their consciousness preserved and elevated, free from the limitations of single forms. Rodriguez came back last month. She'd heard about the changes, about what we'd become. She took one look at my transformed state, the way my skin shifted with my emotions, the extra organs I'd grown to process new sensory input, and asked just one question. Does it hurt? No, I told her truthfully. It's like finally breathing after holding your breath your whole life. She underwent the integration that night. I held her hand as the entities rewrote her biology, as she screamed and laughed and was reborn. When it was over, she looked at me with eyes that saw across spectrums humans had never imagined and smiled. I understand now, she said, why they needed us, why we needed them. We patrol together now, two rangers maintaining the balance in a forest that's no longer quite on Earth. We catalog the new species emerging from the convergence of dimensions, guide the newly integrated through their transformations, and prepare for the greater changes coming. Because Wakatoma was just the beginning. All 17 convergence points are active now, reality wearing thin as Earth synchronizes with the greater ecosystem. Cities report strange sightings, shadows that move independently, buildings that exist in too many dimensions, people who are there one moment and elsewhere the next. The integration spreads like wildfire, carried by those who've undergone the change. We're not infectious in the traditional sense, but our presence catalyzes transformation in those ready to evolve. Some call us angels, others demons. We're neither. We're what humanity needs to become to survive the cosmic spring that's arriving. Webb's reports grow more urgent with each passing week. Governments scramble to understand and control what's happening, but you can't contain evolution. You can't fight the tide of cosmic change with bullets and bureaucracy. All you can do is adapt or be left behind. I write this from the observation tower at Station 47, watching the aurora dance across a sky that shows too many stars. The entities flow through the forest below, tending to reality's garden, preparing the soil for what's to come. In the distance, I can see new growths, structures that exist partially in our dimension, partially elsewhere, bridging the gap between what was and what will be. Tomorrow, another group arrives for integration. Volunteers who've chosen transformation over stagnation, evolution over extinction. I'll guide them through the process, hold them as their bodies rebel and reform, welcome them to the new world being born. The old world is ending. It has to. It was always too small, too limited, too isolated from the greater cosmos. But endings are also beginnings, and what emerges from Wakatoma's shadows isn't death but metamorphosis. I think of everyone who vanished in these woods, everyone who paid the price for humanity's stubborn refusal to evolve. They weren't victims, they were pioneers, the first to cross over, to show us the way forward. Their sacrifice opened the door we're all walking through now. The forest calls to me. It's time for my nightly patrol. Time to walk the paths between worlds and tend to the boundary between what is and what's becoming. I leave this account as a record, a testimony, a warning, and an invitation. Wakatama waits. The entities watch. The door stands open. The only question is, will you step through? Something massive crashed through the tree line, snapping saplings like pencils, and I understood in a heartbeat that it wanted us silent and gone. So I dragged my sister behind the camper door and chambered around before it found the handle. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Caleb Turner, and this happened to me back in 2013 in the Ajatia National Forest, Arkansas. What began as a simple escape from routine morphed into a nightmare that still visits me in the darkest hours of night, when the rational mind surrenders to memory. Hannah and I had planned the trip for months. Our parents had passed 3 years prior, a head-on collision with a drunk driver on Route 7, and we'd been drifting apart ever since. She dove into her graduate studies at the University of Arkansas, and I buried myself in 12-hour shifts at the lumber mill. We'd become strangers sharing the same last name. Dad's old Class C RV had sat under a tarp in my backyard, gathering rust and housing spiders. I spent 6 weekends bringing it back to life, replacing gaskets, patching the roof, scrubbing mildew from every surface. Hannah called it a waste of time. Just sell it, she'd said. Who has time for camping anymore? But some impulse kept me working on it. Maybe I needed a piece of the past to carry forward. The morning we left, fog clung to the valleys like reluctant ghosts. I picked Hannah up at 5:30 a.m., and she climbed in without a word, eyes heavy with sleep. 3 hours and 2 gas station coffees later, we turned onto Forest Service Road 512, a rutted dirt path barely wide enough for the camper's bulk. Branches scraped the windows like fingernails, testing for weakness. The logging spur I found wasn't on any map. Just a narrow cutout carved years ago and half reclaimed by nature. Perfect for 24 hours off the grid. Just siblings and tall pines and the hush you only hear when the world forgets you. I parked beside a dry creek bed, set the jacks and hung a tarp for shade. She laughed at how I fussed with the little things, tightening lug nuts, checking the propane line twice, while she strung a hammock like she'd been born with rope in her fists. "You haven't changed," she said, testing the hammock's tension, still making sure the sky won't fall. I didn't mention how her smile had changed, grown sharper at the edges. Grief carves people differently. The forest pressed in around us, ancient pines stretching upward like vertebrae of some colossal spine. The June air hung thick with humidity and the sweet rot smell of last autumn's decay. No highways, no cell service, no distant rumble of civilization. Nothing but wilderness for miles. When Hannah wandered toward the creek to skip stones, I noticed how the birds went quiet as she passed. Not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had pressed a universal mute button. I told myself it was coincidence. I was securing the awning when my hand froze mid-motion. 20 yards out, just within the tree line, a pine swayed against the wind. Not much, just enough to register as wrong. No breeze stirred the others, just that one tree, rocking slightly, as if something substantial had brushed against it and continued on. "Hannah?" I called. "Over here," she replied from the opposite direction. I stared at that tree until my eyes watered. Nothing moved, but a sensation crept up my spine, the ancestral awareness that eyes were watching from shadow. We built a fire pit from creek stones and gathered deadfall for the evening. Hannah kept glancing at her watch, already counting down the hours until return to civilization. I found myself listening more than talking. For wildlife, for wind, for anything to explain the silence that had settled over our clearing like a blanket. "It's so quiet," Hannah finally said, voicing my thoughts. "Shouldn't there be more birds? Squirrels?" I nodded. Maybe a storm's coming, but the sky remained clear, a perfect blue canvas stretching over treetops. No clouds, no distant thunder, just stillness. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, I caught Hannah staring at the forest edge, her brow furrowed. "I think I saw something move," she said. "Like someone walking between the trees, but tall, really tall." "Probably a deer," I offered, though deer don't typically stand upright. "Yeah," she agreed too quickly. "Probably." We prepared an early dinner. Hot dogs charred over the fire, baked beans from a can, cheap beer still cold from the cooler. Simple food that tasted better than it had any right to. For the first time in years, conversation flowed easily between us. We reminisced about childhood camping trips with Dad, his terrible ghost stories, Mom's insistence on bringing a French press for proper coffee, even in the wilderness. The sun began its descent, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for our campsite, with deliberate intent. "Remember how Dad used to tell us the forest was alive?" Hannah said, watching the darkening woods. "That it was all one organism connected underground?" I nodded. "Mycorrhizal networks, fungal connections between tree roots." He was right about that. Trees really do communicate through them. What if they're warning each other about us right now? Her voice had taken on an edge. What if we're the invasion? Before I could answer, a sound cut through the twilight. A long, low moan that was neither human nor animal. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something between that raised the hair on my arms. It echoed through the forest, bouncing off trees until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Hannah's face drained of color. "What was that?" "Wind in the rocks," I said, though we both knew it wasn't. Sound plays tricks out here. The call didn't repeat. But something had changed in the atmosphere around us. The air felt heavier, charged with an electric anticipation. The shadows between trees seemed deeper, more absolute. I added another log to the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. The flames cast our surroundings in flickering orange light, creating a small island of warmth against the encroaching darkness. Beyond our circle of light, the forest had become an impenetrable wall of black. "Maybe we should go for a hike tomorrow morning," Hannah suggested, her voice too bright. "Before we head back, explore a bit." I nodded, knowing what she was really asking. "Let's confirm there's nothing out there. Let's prove to ourselves this unease is just imagination." "Sure. We can follow the creek bed north. Might find some interesting tracks." We had no idea then how prophetic those words would be, or how deeply we would regret our curiosity. Night fell completely. The fire popped and hissed. And somewhere in the darkness beyond our light, something moved with deliberate patience, circling our fragile shelter, assessing, waiting. Morning arrived with a blanket of fog that muffled sound and reduced visibility to 20 feet in any direction. I woke before Hannah, my neck stiff from sleeping upright in the dinette booth, a hunting knife within easy reach. The silence of the previous day had given way to normal forest sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the occasional rustle of undergrowth. Whatever strange tension had gripped the area seemed to have passed with the night. Hannah emerged from the camper's small bedroom looking surprisingly rested. "Sleep okay?" I asked, pouring her a cup of instant coffee. "Better than expected," she admitted. "Though I had weird dreams, something scratching at the walls trying to get in." She shrugged. "Probably just branches against the roof." I didn't mention that there were no trees close enough to touch the camper, nor that I'd spent half the night listening to the same sounds, soft, deliberate scrapes along the aluminum siding that moved systematically around the vehicle's perimeter. By morning light, they were easy to dismiss as imagination. After a quick breakfast of granola bars and fruit, we set out to explore. The fog was lifting, revealing a forest transformed by overnight dew. Spider webs sparkled between branches, and mushrooms had sprouted in damp hollows. Beautiful, if you didn't look too closely at the unnatural patterns they formed, almost like arrows pointing deeper into the woods. A little before noon, we followed the creek north as planned. The bed was mostly dry, just occasional pools of stagnant water reflecting the sky, perfect for tracking. Dad had taught us the basics, how to distinguish coyote from fox, deer from elk, domestic dog from wolf. Skills I'd assumed would never prove useful in modern life. The first prints appeared about a quarter-mile from camp. At first glance, they resembled large dog tracks. The details jarred me to a stop. They were too wide to be coyote, toes spread like a hand pressed in mud. The claws etched deep furrows. Each pad impression was unusually distinct, as if whatever made them carried significant weight. Hannah whistled. "Big dog," she said. I wanted to say wolf, but swallowed it. Arkansas hadn't seen a wild wolf in a century, but the tracks marched on, and each step sat 9 inches ahead of the last. The stride length alone suggested something massive, a creature that would stand chest-high to a tall man. "Could be feral," I offered. "Some dogs go wild in these forests." Hannah crouched to examine a particularly clear impression. "No dog I've ever seen has toes that articulated. Look how they spread, almost like fingers." She was right. There was something unnervingly hand-like about the prints, despite the claws and pads that marked them as canine. I found myself scanning the forest edge, suddenly aware of how exposed we were in the open creek bed. "Let's keep going," I said. "But stay close." The tracks continued for nearly half a mile, sometimes disappearing where the creek bed turned rocky, then resuming in patches of sand or mud. They never deviated, never showed signs of sniffing or hunting behavior typical of canines. Just a straight, purposeful line heading north. Then the prints changed. Suddenly they showed only the front half of the foot, as if the creature had risen to walk on its hind legs. The spacing widened to nearly 4 feet apart. Hannah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in. Caleb, she whispered, pointing ahead. We found the deer half a mile further. It hung 5 feet off the ground, wedged between forked branches, back broken, ribs open. No scavenger does that. No ordinary hunter either. Nothing was taken. The hide looked peeled rather than cut, meat still steaming in the shade. The carcass was fresh. No bloat, no flies, no scavenger marks. It had been killed within hours, perhaps while we slept peacefully in our camper. Blood had pooled beneath it, soaking into the ground in a near-perfect circle. The deer's eyes remained open, clouded with terror. Hannah gagged. I pulled her back and kept my mouth shut about how the stomach was missing, like someone had reached in and scooped it clean. The cavity was almost surgical in its precision. One organ removed, the rest untouched. The deer's legs were broken in multiple places, compound fractures with bone fragments missing entirely, as if something had extracted them. "We need to go," Hannah whispered. "Now." As we turned to leave, I noticed something we'd missed on our approach. A symbol carved into the trunk of the tree holding the deer. 3 vertical lines crossed by 2 horizontal ones. Not fresh. The bark had grown around the edges, suggesting it was years old. "Wait," I said, stepping closer. "Have you seen this before?" Hannah glanced at it and shook her head. "Probably just trail markers. Hunters use them." Her voice was tight, controlled panic simmering beneath. I took out my phone and snapped a photo, though I couldn't have explained why. Something primitive in my brain recognized the marking as significant. A warning, perhaps, or a claim of territory. We hurried back toward camp, no longer following the creek but cutting straight through the forest. Neither of us spoke. The sounds of wildlife had disappeared again, leaving only our labored breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. Halfway back, Hannah stopped abruptly. "Listen," she whispered. I froze, straining to hear whatever had caught her attention. At first, nothing. Then, a rhythmic scraping sound from somewhere to our right. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause, like claws dragging slowly across bark. We changed direction, giving the sound a wide berth. The forest seemed to close in around us, trees that had appeared widely spaced now standing shoulder to shoulder, blocking sight lines, creating corridors that led us further from our intended path. "I think we're going in circles," Hannah said after 20 minutes of increasingly disoriented hiking. She was right. The same lightning-struck pine had appeared in our path twice now. Somehow, despite heading what I was certain was south, we kept returning to this spot. "This is impossible," I muttered, pulling out my compass. The needle spun lazily, refusing to settle. "Something's wrong with the equipment." Hannah's face had gone pale. "Or something's wrong with the forest." I was about to dismiss her comment when a branch snapped loudly behind us. Not the small crack of wildlife, but the sharp report of substantial weight. We both turned, scanning the trees, seeing nothing but shadows and dappled sunlight. "Hello?" I called, immediately regretting it. No response. Just the unnatural silence that had become all too familiar. "Let's move," I said, taking Hannah's hand. "Stay close." We pushed forward, no longer trying to navigate but simply putting distance between ourselves and whatever stalked us. The terrain began to look familiar. The distinctive boulder we'd passed that morning, the fallen oak we'd climbed over. The forest was finally allowing us to leave. When we broke through the tree line into our campsite, the relief was physical, a weight lifting from my chest. The camper sat exactly as we'd left it, sunlight glinting off its aluminum sides, ordinary and wonderful in its mundane reality. We hurried to camp. I cleaned the Remington, slid deer slugs into the tube, then stoked a fire big enough to see from space. My hands trembled as I worked, adrenaline still coursing through my system. "What are you doing?" Hannah asked, watching me load the rifle. "Precaution," I replied. "Probably nothing. Probably nothing," she repeated, her voice hollow. Like those tracks were probably nothing? Like that deer was probably nothing? I had no answer. We both knew what we'd seen defied rational explanation. Something unnatural hunted these woods. Something that killed for reasons beyond food or territorial defense. Day sank behind the ridge line. Cicadas quit early. Even the frogs along the creek went still. At dusk, the approaching night felt heavy with malice. "We could leave," Hannah suggested, eyes fixed on the darkening forest. "Just pack up and go." The thought had crossed my mind. But something, pride, stubbornness, or simple male stupidity, made me shake my head. "It's getting too dark to navigate those roads safely. We're better off here until morning." I didn't voice my deeper fear, that whatever was out there would follow us, that leaving meant exchanging the relative security of our campsite for the vulnerability of narrow forest roads where trees crowded the shoulders and turnouts were few. Hannah pointed past the flames. 2 amber dots floated between cedars, too high for a cougar, too far apart for a bobcat. They vanished when I swung the flashlight. A moment later, branches snapped left of the camper. Something circled. We spoke in whispers, and every whisper felt too loud. Night settled fully over the forest, and with it came the certainty that we were being watched from every angle, that our fire, rather than deterring the thing that stalked us, simply made us easier to observe. I checked and rechecked the rifle, a ritual of false security. Hannah sat with her back to the camper, eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond our fire's reach. Neither of us suggested sleep. Neither of us believed it possible. The hours stretched, marked only by the gradual consumption of firewood and the occasional distant sound, branches moving without wind, heavy steps retreating when I raised the flashlight, the slow, deliberate circling of something large enough to make the earth tremble slightly with each footfall. "I saw those symbols before," Hannah said suddenly, breaking an hour of silence. "When I was in undergrad, ancient cultures of the Ozarks, they found cave paintings with those marks, 3 vertical lines crossed by 2 horizontal, associated with something called the Tall Ones." "What Tall Ones?" I asked, feeding another log to the fire. The professor thought it was a mistranslation from Cherokee legends, a bogeyman story to keep kids from wandering too far into the forest. She hugged her knees to her chest. Stories about creatures that walked like men but weren't men, that hung their kills in trees as offerings. Offerings to what? Hannah shook her head. That's where the translation gets murky. Something older than the tribes. Something that lived beneath the mountains. The Cherokee avoided certain valleys entirely, claimed they belonged to the Tall Ones. A heavy silence fell between us. The fire popped and hissed. "It's just folklore," I said finally. "Every culture has monster stories." "Then what killed that deer, Caleb? What made those tracks? What's out there right now, watching us?" I had no answer that wouldn't terrify us both. By 10 o'clock, the forest had transformed into something malevolent. Shadows writhed between trees, animated by our fire's flickering light. The darkness beyond our clearing seemed absolute, as if the woods had been replaced by a void that swallowed sound and light alike. I bolted the door at 9. The floor trembled once at 10, as if a shoulder had brushed the aluminum skin. No howl, no bark, just the steady scuff of mass against dust. Hannah sat at the dinette table, the 20-gauge shotgun I'd given her, resting across her lap. Her fingers traced nervous patterns on the worn wood grain. "We should have left," she whispered. "We should have listened to our instincts." I nodded, unable to argue. The camper suddenly felt absurdly fragile. Thin aluminum walls, single-pane windows, hollow core door, a temporary bubble of civilization in a wilderness that wanted us gone. Outside, something heavy moved past the fire pit. The flames bent as if disturbed by a substantial mass displacing air. I peered through the blinds but saw only darkness and the occasional glint of reflected firelight from the tree line. "What do you see?" Hannah asked, voice tight. "Nothing." I let the blind fall back into place. "But it's there." The weight of unseen eyes pressed against the camper's walls. Every shadow held menace, every creak of settling metal amplified by our fear. I remembered how Hannah had mentioned the Tall Ones from Cherokee legend, creatures that hung kills in trees as offerings to something older, something beneath the mountains. Wichita was ancient ground. These forests had stood since before European contact, before even the tribes that later claimed them. What might have evolved here, isolated and unchallenged? What might have learned to hunt in the shadows between historical record and folklore? I checked my watch, 10:47 p.m. Hours still until dawn. "I'm going to try to sleep," Hannah said, though we both knew it for the lie it was. "Wake me for second watch." She retreated to the back bedroom, shotgun still in hand. I heard the soft click of the door latch, then silence. I took position by the front window, rifle across my knees, and prepared for a long night. The fire outside burned lower. I considered venturing out to add more wood, then thought better of it. The darkness beyond our camper felt too absolute, too hostile. Let the flames die. We had the propane furnace if the night grew cold. I slept an hour maybe, head lolling against the window frame. Strange dreams plagued that brief unconsciousness, running through endless forest, pursued by something that moved just beyond the corner of my vision. The sensation of hot breath on my neck, of claws scraping bone. At midnight the spare tire thudded to the ground. Metal squealed. Bolts had been sheared, not unscrewed. The sound jolted me awake, heart hammering against my ribs. For a moment I couldn't orient myself. The unfamiliar confines of the camper, the absolute darkness outside the windows. Then memory flooded back, along with the certainty that whatever had been circling us had finally decided to investigate more closely. I cracked the window. Moonlight showed a figure taller than the door, fur the color of wet slate, shoulders bunched like a man who hews timber, legs bent backward at the ankle. Its head was canine yet wrong, snout blunt like a hyena, ears torn, teeth too many, and set in crooked rows. The creature moved with a hunter's deliberate patience, testing the camper's exterior, searching for weakness. It ran long fingers along the seams where panels joined, probed the windows with claws that left scratches in the glass. There was intelligence in its movements, not just animal curiosity, but methodical examination. I eased the window closed and backed away, rifle clutched to my chest. My hands trembled so violently I feared I might accidentally discharge the weapon. The rational part of my brain cataloged details even as the primitive part screamed for flight. 7 feet tall at minimum, bipedal but with digitigrade legs like a dog's, covered in dense fur except for the chest and abdomen, which showed scarred flesh stretched over prominent ribs. A branch snapped outside the bedroom window. Hannah's muffled gasp told me she'd seen it too. The creature paused, head tilting in an unsettlingly human gesture of interest. It moved toward the sound, passing out of my view. I heard scratching at the bedroom window. Slow, deliberate drags of claws against glass. Hannah's breathing quickened, audible even through the thin interior wall. The scratching stopped. Silence stretched for 30 seconds. Then, a soft tapping, rhythmic and controlled. Not random animal curiosity, but deliberate communication. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Hannah's voice, barely audible. It wants me to open the window. Cold horror washed through me. Not just a predator then. Something that understood the concept of shelter, of barriers, of negotiating entry. Something that might once have been human, or close enough to understand human behavior. I moved silently to the bedroom door and eased it open. Hannah stood frozen by the window, shotgun forgotten at her side, staring at a hand pressed flat against the glass. A hand with too many joints, with claws curving from fingertips, with pads like those we'd seen in the tracks. Behind it, amber eyes reflected moonlight. I pulled her away from the window. "Don't look at it," I whispered, though I couldn't have explained why this felt important. "Don't engage." The tapping resumed, more insistent now. The glass vibrated with each impact. A low, rumbling growl filtered through the thin barrier. Not anger, but frustration, the sound of a predator momentarily denied. We retreated to the main cabin, Hannah clutching my arm with bloodless fingers. The creature followed our movement, heavy steps circling back to the front of the camper. Its shadow passed across the kitchenette window, momentarily blocking the faint moonlight. Something scraped along the aluminum siding. Claws or teeth, testing for weakness. "What does it want?" Hannah's voice trembled. "I don't know." A lie. Something in me understood perfectly what it wanted. Us. Our heat. Our fear. Our lives reduced to cooling meat hung between forked branches, an offering to whatever ancient horror the Cherokee had avoided for centuries. The attack came without warning. One moment, relative silence. The next, the camper rocked violently as something massive struck the roof. Metal buckled inward above the kitchenette, forming a depression the size of a basketball. Dust and insulation rained down. The creature moved across the roof with surprising grace, testing different sections with what sounded like deliberate blows. Hannah screamed, a short, strangled sound cut off by her own hand. I raised the rifle toward the ceiling, tracking the movement above us, knowing a shot through the roof would be a desperate gamble at best. The assault paused. In the silence that followed, I heard what sounded like sniffing, deep, powerful inhalations as the creature scented us through the metal barrier. It moved to the front of the camper, directly above the driver's compartment, then grew still. "What's it doing?" Hannah whispered. I shook my head, straining to hear any movement. Nothing. Just the heavy, patient presence of something waiting. The minutes stretched. 5, then 10. No movement, no sound. Had it given up? Left to seek easier prey? The hope had barely formed when a new sound emerged, a wet, rhythmic slapping against the roof. It took me a moment to identify it. The creature was licking the metal, tongue rasping across the surface. "Jesus," Hannah breathed. The licking continued, moving methodically across the roof as if tasting our fear through the barrier. The implications twisted my stomach, not just hunting behavior, but something ritualistic, something that savored the anticipation as much as the kill itself. Suddenly, it stopped. Heavy footsteps retreated to the edge of the roof, then silence. I moved cautiously to the window and peered out. The creature had returned to ground level and now crouched by the propane tank, head tilted in that same unsettling expression of curiosity. It reached out with one hand, 3 thick fingers, pads like leather, claws curved sickle-sharp, and tapped the tank lightly. The metal rang faintly. It understood. It recognized the tank as significant, connected to our shelter. Intelligence gleamed in those amber eyes, a calculated assessment of risk and reward. It circled the tank once, sniffing along the valve and connection hose, then retreated several steps. watching the camper as if expecting a reaction. When none came, it approached again, this time gripping the tank in both hands. Muscles bunched beneath matted fur as it prepared to wrench the tank free. I raised the rifle, sighted through the window. If it ruptured the propane line, my finger tensed on the trigger. Before I could fire, the creature released the tank and straightened, head swiveling toward the forest. It stood motionless, ears swiveling like satellite dishes tracking a signal. Something had caught its attention, something beyond our perception. A low, vibrating growl rumbled from its chest, not directed at us, but at whatever unseen presence had disturbed it. It took a step toward the tree line, hackles rising along its spine. From deep in the forest came an answering sound. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something between that raised the hair on my arms. The same sound we'd heard at dusk, now closer, more distinct. A challenge. The creature's reaction was immediate and surprising. It backed away from the camper, eyes still fixed on the forest, body language shifting from predatory confidence to wary defensiveness. Another howl scream echoed through the trees, and the creature snarled in response, but it was retreating now, moving away from our camper toward the opposite tree line. Hannah gripped my arm. "What's happening?" "I don't know," I admitted. But something out there just scared it off. We watched in disbelief as the creature loped into the forest, quickly swallowed by darkness. The sound that had driven it away didn't repeat. Silence settled once more over the clearing, but it felt different now, expectant rather than menacing. "Should we leave?" Hannah whispered. "While it's gone?" I considered it. The creature had retreated, but something had caused that retreat. Something potentially worse, waiting in the darkness beyond our fire's dying light. "No," I said finally. "We stay put. Keep watch. At first light we go." Hannah nodded, exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. The adrenaline that had sustained us was ebbing, leaving shaky weakness in its wake. "I'll take first watch," I said. "Try to rest." She didn't argue, just curled onto the dinette bench, shotgun still within reach. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep, the body's desperate attempt to process trauma. I returned to my position by the window, rifle ready, watching the tree line where the creature had disappeared. The fire outside had burned to embers, casting just enough light to define the edge of our clearing. Beyond that, absolute darkness reigned. Whatever had driven our tormentor away remained hidden. Friend or foe, it kept its distance, maintaining a presence felt rather than seen. The night stretched toward dawn, each minute an eternity of tense vigilance. Around 3 a.m. a sound pulled me from half-sleep, branches moving at the edge of the clearing. I raised the rifle, peering into darkness. Nothing visible, just the sense of mass displacing shadow. The feeling of being watched intensified, but different now. Calculating, assessing. Our original tormentor had stalked with malice. This presence observed with cold curiosity. Somehow, that felt worse. I woke Hannah at 4 a.m. for her watch, my eyes burning with exhaustion. "Anything?" she asked, instantly alert. "Nothing definite," I said. "But something's still out there. Something different." She nodded grimly, taking the rifle I offered. 2 more hours till dawn. Get some sleep." I stretched out on the bench she'd vacated, sleep already pulling at my consciousness. My last thought before darkness claimed me. What nightmares hunt the nightmares? Hannah's scream tore me from sleep, a primal sound of terror that cut through exhaustion like a blade. I lurched upright, disoriented in the pre-dawn gloom. The camper's interior was bathed in faint blue light filtering through the windows. Not quite night anymore, not yet day. The dangerous hour when predators make their final attempts. "It's back!" Hannah gasped, rifle aimed at the front windshield. "And it's not alone." I scrambled to her side, heart hammering against my ribs. Through the glass I saw them, 3 dark shapes at the edge of the clearing. The central figure I recognized from the night before, 7 feet of corded muscle and matted fur. It stood slightly hunched, arms too long for its frame, head cocked at that unsettlingly inquisitive angle. Flanking it were 2 smaller creatures, similar in form but reduced in scale. Cubs? Adolescents? They moved with the same deliberate grace as the larger one, testing the air with twitching noses, amber eyes fixed on our fragile shelter. "They hunt in packs," I whispered, the revelation settling like ice in my stomach. Not just a solitary predator, but a social species, with all the tactical advantages that implied. The 3 creatures spread out, encircling our camper with coordinated precision. The largest, the one that had tormented us through the night, took position by the propane tank again. The others moved to opposite sides, effectively cutting off any potential escape route. "What do we do?" Hannah's voice was steady despite her fear, a small miracle I silently thanked her for. I assessed our options, none of them good. The camper offered minimal protection against determined attackers. The forest road lay 100 yards away through dense underbrush. Even if we reached the road, we'd be exposed during the long drive out. "We make a stand," I said finally. "Together." Hannah nodded, chambering a round in the rifle with grim determination. I checked the 20-gauge shotgun and the Springfield 45 I'd retrieved from the glove box. Limited ammunition, but each shot would count if I made it so. Outside, the creatures had grown still, a coordinated pause that suggested communication beyond our perception. The largest raised its head toward the lightning sky, nostrils flaring. Time was against them. Whatever advantage darkness provided was fading with approaching dawn. As if reaching the same conclusion, it moved suddenly, crossing the distance to the camper in 3 fluid strides. It pressed one hand against the fiberglass, then sniffed along the seam as if reading the scent of my fear. Hannah raised the rifle, sighting through the window. "Wait," I whispered. "Not yet." The other 2 creatures had begun circling, testing different sections of the camper, probing for weakness. One paused by the rear corner, head tilting as it examined the juncture where wall met frame. It pressed experimentally, then harder. Metal groaned. "They know the weak points," I realized aloud. "They're not just animals." Hannah's eyes widened. "Caleb, they're hunting us. Intelligently hunting us." The largest creature moved to the driver's side window, rising to its full height to peer inside. For one terrible moment, its eyes met mine through the glass. Ancient amber irises, swimming with something beyond animal intelligence. Recognition flickered there, and worse, amusement. It understood our fear, savored it like seasoning before a meal. I fired through the pane, glass burst. The slug hit ribs with a wet smack and the thing rocked but didn't drop. It turned amber gaze on me and issued a sound half bark, half scream. That pitch drilled through my molars. It slapped the sidewall, walked 3 steps and tore the awning free as it went. The 2 smaller creatures responded immediately to the injured leader's cry, converging on the front of the camper. One leaped onto the hood, powerful hind legs denting the metal. It clawed at the windshield, leaving deep scratches in the safety glass. Hannah screamed for me to drive. I jumped behind the wheel, cranked the starter. The engine coughed, sputtered, and refused. Battery was strong, starter relay clicked, fuel pump whined, yet nothing caught. The thing rammed the rear corner, rocking us onto 2 wheels. Dishes shattered. "They've damaged something," I shouted, trying again. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, as if some crucial connection had been severed. No coincidence, they'd targeted the vehicle specifically, disabled it with deliberate intent. The wall bent inward by the bathroom sink, claws carved grooves. Hannah fired. The blast lit the cabin blue. Pellets peppered metal and the thing flinched back, snarling spit and fur. The shotgun's report echoed in the confined space, leaving my ears ringing. "The propane," I yelled, pulling the portfort from my waistband. "We need to create a diversion." I saw the pattern. It tested seams, pushing where screws met plywood, patient like an engineer. The propane tank sat outside, chained to the step. I pulled a road flare from the dash kit, struck it, kicked the door, and hurled the flare under the tank. Red flame spun, landed in dry needles. When the animal rushed for the noise, I ducked out the opposite side, rifle slung. Night air smelled of cedar and copper. My pulse drummed so loud I missed its first stride. It cleared the fire pit and a bound, landed 10 feet away, hunched, favoring the slugged side. Steam coiled off matted fur. The 2 smaller creatures hesitated, momentarily confused by my exit from the camper. The leader recovered quickly, however, amber eyes narrowing as it assessed this new development. It growled something that might have been communication to its companions, a series of low barks and rumbling sounds that sent them circling to flank me. I planted my feet, exhaled, squeezed. The .308 cracked. A bullet punched above the left eye. Bone chips fanned out, but it kept coming. Slower now, head cocked, one eye ruined. It swiped. I felt wind on my cheek, though it missed. Dark fluid leaked from the creature's shattered eye socket, a viscous substance too thick to be blood. It staggered but remained upright, driven by a resilience beyond normal physiology. The smaller ones pulled back slightly, watching their leader with what appeared to be concern. I stepped in, jammed the barrel under its jaw, and fired again. Black fluid splashed my sleeves. The thing spasmed, knocked me flat, then staggered toward the creek, tracing a line of dark heat across moonlit sand. The impact drove the breath from my lungs. I lay stunned, rifle knocked from my grasp, staring up at the lightning sky. Dawn was breaking, pale fingers of light reaching through the trees. From the camper came Hannah's voice, frantic. "Caleb, get up!" I rolled to my side, pain lancing through my shoulder where I'd struck the ground. The 2 smaller creatures approached cautiously, torn between pursuing their wounded leader and finishing the prey before them. Their movements betrayed uncertainty, the pack structure disrupted by the Alpha's injury. Hannah appeared in the camper doorway, shotgun raised. "Get behind me," she shouted. I scrambled to my feet, retrieving the fallen rifle. The creatures watched us, muscles tensed for attack. A standoff, broken only when a howl echoed from the direction the leader had fled, a sound of pain and frustrated rage. The smaller ones responded immediately, turning as one and loping toward the creek bed, abandoning the hunt to attend their wounded Alpha. Within seconds they had vanished into the underbrush, leaving only trampled grass and deep claw marks in the earth as evidence of their presence. Hannah dragged me by the collar behind a stump. We waited, guns up, until the forest took back its quiet. The fire reached the propane line, blue flame roared skyward. Light rolled across the clearing like dawn. We saw no sign of the animal, but the ground told its path. Thick drops, wide strides, then nothing, as if the earth had opened and swallowed it. "Did you kill it?" Hannah asked, voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "Wounded it. Badly, I think. But no, it's still out there." We remained in our defensive position as true dawn broke over the forest. The camper stood battered but intact, the propane fire finally sputtering out as the tank emptied. Birds began to call tentatively from distant trees. Normal forest sounds gradually returned, as if nature itself was testing whether the nightmare had truly passed. "We need to go," Hannah said after nearly 30 minutes of vigilant waiting. "They could come back." I nodded, rising stiffly. My shoulder throbbed where I'd fallen, and dried black fluid crusted my sleeves where the creature's wound had sprayed me. It had an odd, chemical smell, not the copper tang of blood, but something mineral and ancient, like water drawn from the deepest aquifers. We approached the camper cautiously. Claw marks scored the aluminum siding in long parallel grooves. The spare tire lay 20 feet away, mounting bolts sheared clean. One window was completely shattered, others cracked in spiderweb patterns. The hood bore deep dents where powerful legs had launched against it. "Can you fix it?" Hannah asked, eyes constantly scanning the tree line. I examined the engine compartment. The creatures had been methodical in their sabotage. Fuel line severed, distributor cap cracked, battery cables shredded. Basic mechanical knowledge, applied with surgical precision. "I can splice the fuel line," I said, already reaching for the toolbox. "Enough to get us out of here. The rest will have to wait." Hannah stood guard while I worked, shotgun ready, jumping at every sound from the forest. The sun climbed higher, burning off lingering fog, and casting the clearing in deceptively peaceful light. The violence of the night seemed almost dreamlike now, contradicted by the mundane beauty of morning in the wilderness. Almost dreamlike, except for the evidence all around us. The ruined camper, the black fluid staining my clothes, the deep tracks in soft earth, and the nagging certainty that somewhere in those woods, the creatures were regrouping, nursing their wounded leader, perhaps planning another attack. After 20 minutes of frantic repairs, I closed the hood. That should do it. It won't be pretty, but it'll get us to the main road. We gathered our essential belongings in silence, abandoning anything not immediately necessary. Hannah kept watch while I maneuvered the damaged camper around, pointing it toward the narrow track that would lead us back to civilization. The engine coughed twice, then caught with a roar that seemed obscenely loud in the forest quiet. As we pulled away from the clearing, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a moment I thought I saw movement at the edge of the trees, a tall, hunched silhouette watching our departure with one gleaming amber eye. Then we rounded a bend, and the clearing disappeared from view. The forest road stretched ahead, dappled with morning light. Hannah sat rigid beside me, shotgun across her lap, eyes fixed on the windshield. Neither of us spoke. Words seemed inadequate for what we'd experienced, for what we'd glimpsed of a world existing alongside our own, separated by the thinnest of veils. I pressed the accelerator, urging the damaged camper faster along the rutted track. Every shadow between trees held potential threat. Every movement in peripheral vision caused my heart to stutter. The creatures might be behind us, but their presence had seeped into our consciousness, a permanent stain that no distance could fully remove. The main forest road appeared ahead, its graveled surface a welcome sight after the primitive track we'd followed. As we turned onto it, Hannah released a long, shuddering breath. Not relief exactly, but acknowledgement that we'd survived the first phase of our escape. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" she asked softly. I thought of the tracks, the mutilated deer, the intelligence in those amber eyes. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm not sure I believe it myself, and I was there." She nodded, understanding perfectly the peculiar loneliness of witnessing the impossible. "They were hunting us, Caleb. Not for food. They left that deer untouched. They hunt for something else." The camper rattled over a pothole, the damaged suspension groaning in protest. 5 more miles to the ranger station, 5 more miles through forest that no longer felt like wilderness but like territory, claimed, marked, and defended by something older than human memory. The Cherokee knew, Hannah murmured, almost to herself. They left warnings, those symbols, stories about the tall ones. We just didn't listen. The road curved ahead, sunlight flashing between trees and strobe-like pulses. Something dark moved across the path, too quickly for clear identification, just a suggestion of height and wrong-angled limbs. I swerved instinctively, though by the time we reached the spot, nothing remained but disturbed leaves. "They're pacing us," Hannah whispered, knuckles white around the shotgun. I pressed the accelerator harder, pushing the damaged vehicle to its limits. The engine whined in protest, but the speedometer crept upward. Trees flashed past in a green blur. A mile from the ranger station, we rounded a bend and found the road blocked. A massive pine lay across the gravel, too recently fallen for road crews to have cleared it. Saw marks scored the trunk near the base, deliberate and precise. "They cut it," Hannah breathed. "They knew we'd come this way." I slammed the brakes, the camper skidding to a halt 10 feet from the blockade. For a moment we sat in stunned silence, the engine idling roughly. Then, movement in the trees to our right, a flash of gray fur, the glint of amber eyes. "Back up," Hannah urged. "We need to find another way out." I shifted into reverse, turning to look through the rear window. The blood froze in my veins. Standing 20 yards behind us, directly in the center of the road, was the leader. One eye ruined, black fluid still seeping from the wound but very much alive, very much hunting. It raised its muzzle, testing the air, then fixed its remaining eye on our vehicle. Recognition flashed in that amber depth, followed by something that might have been satisfaction. It had driven us exactly where it wanted us. "Drive," Hannah screamed. "Just go." I slammed the camper into first gear and floored the accelerator, aiming for the narrow space between the fallen tree and the ditch. The camper lurched forward, engine screaming. Behind us, the creature dropped to all fours and charged, covering ground with horrifying speed. We hit the shoulder at an angle, the camper tilting dangerously. Branches scraped the roof as we squeezed past the tree blockade, tires spinning in loose gravel. For one terrible moment, I thought we'd get stuck. Then the wheels caught, and we lurched forward, back onto the road beyond the barrier. In the side mirror, I caught a glimpse of the creature clearing the fallen tree in a single bound, landing on the road behind us. It stood upright, watching our escape with that same unsettling intelligence. It made no attempt to pursue further, as if it had tested us and found the result satisfactory for now. The ranger station appeared ahead, a wooden building with a green metal roof. Relief washed through me at the sight of official vehicles parked outside, at the evidence of other humans nearby. We pulled into the lot, the camper's engine giving one final protesting cough before dying completely. Rangers drove in at sunrise, called by a pilot who spotted the flare plume. They studied the wrecked camper, the prints, the torn awning. They bagged fur stuck in bent metal but said nothing as they worked, eyes tracking the shadows like men who suddenly doubted pine trees. One ranger, older man named Dillard, asked if we'd shot a bear. I said no. He looked relieved. "Good," he said. "Paperwork's easier." We both knew he didn't believe his own joke. The look in his eyes told a different story. Recognition, perhaps, of something encountered before but never officially acknowledged. They escorted us down the forest road. At mile 6, we passed the place where I'd wounded the animal, blood still wet on leaves, no body, no drag trail. Dillard stared long, then radioed the district office for more men and heavier rifles. As we left the forest behind, civilization gradually reasserted itself. Gas stations, convenience stores, eventually the outskirts of hot springs. Reality reestablished its dominance, making what we'd experienced seem increasingly dreamlike, increasingly improbable. Yet the black substance on my sleeve remained. The claw marks on the camper couldn't be explained away, and in Hannah's eyes I saw the same haunted awareness that now lived in my own. The knowledge that the wilderness held secrets older and darker than human history. The rangers took our statements, carefully avoiding direct questions about what we'd seen while documenting the damage to the vehicle, with professional thoroughness. They spoke of rogue bears, of feral dog packs, of all the rational explanations that couldn't account for intelligence in amber eyes or strategically cut trees. Hannah and I never retrieved Dad's camper. Insurance wrote it off. I kept the slug that fell from the awning seam when we cleaned up, deformed, double width, coated in something darker than shadow. Physical evidence of an encounter that would shape the rest of our lives. I used to think madness belonged to drunks and poets. Now I know it runs on 4 legs, and sometimes, in the deepest part of night, it walks upright through my dreams, testing the seams of memory with patient, methodical persistence, seeking a way in. 6 months passed before Hannah would speak to me about what happened in Ouachita. 6 months of separate silences, of night terrors that left me gasping in sweat-soaked sheets, of jumping at shadows and flinching at the sound of branches against windows. 6 months of questioning my own sanity while knowing with bone-deep certainty that what we'd witnessed had been real. We met at a coffee shop in Little Rock, neutral territory. November rain pelted the windows, turning the world outside into a gray smear. Hannah looked thinner than I remembered, dark circles beneath her eyes, suggesting sleep had become as elusive for her as it had for me. "I found something," she said without preamble, sliding a manila folder across the table. "In the university archives." I opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of yellowed newspaper clippings dating back to the 1930s, along with more recent reports printed from online sources, all from towns surrounding the Ouachita National Forest, all describing similar incidents: missing hikers, mutilated wildlife, strange tracks found near abandoned campsites. "There's a pattern," Hannah explained, voice low. "Every 7 to 10 years, always in the same general area. Always similar descriptions when there are survivors." I scanned the headlines. Hunter claims Wolfman attacked camp, 1937. Missing family's vehicle found with unusual damage, 1946. Ranger describes upright canine after forest disappearances, 1952. On and on through the decades, the same story playing out with different victims. "Why isn't this common knowledge?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Reports suppressed, witnesses discredited, evidence lost in bureaucratic shuffle. Easier to blame bears, mountain lions, human predators than to acknowledge something outside scientific understanding. "There's more," Hannah said. She pulled out her phone, called up an image. "I've been in contact with a professor of anthropology at Tulane. He specializes in pre-contact Native American cultures in the region." The phone showed a cave painting, crude ochre figures surrounding a central image that made my skin crawl. A tall canine-headed figure, bipedal, with disproportionately long arms. Around it, stick-figure humans hung from schematic trees. Below the scene, 3 vertical lines crossed by 2 horizontal ones, the same symbol we'd seen carved into the tree holding the mutilated deer. "The Cherokee called them those who walk wrong," Hannah explained. Before that, the Caddo had stories about the hungry ones. Different names, same description. Creatures that looked like wolves but walked like men, that took offerings and left them hanging for the old hunger that lived beneath the mountains. I pushed the phone away, suddenly nauseated. "Why are you showing me this?" Hannah's eyes, when they met mine, held the haunted look I recognized from my own mirror. "Because it's happening again. 3 hikers went missing last week, eastern edge of Oharcha. The last campsite they found had," she swallowed hard, "had deer remains hung in the trees, stomachs removed." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the November rain. "We should go to the authorities." "And tell them what? That we encountered mythological creatures? That an ancient evil hunts those woods?" She shook her head. "We tried that already, remember? They wrote it off as a bear attack." She was right. The official report listed our incident as an encounter with an aggressive black bear, possibly rabid. Our descriptions of upright, coordinated predators had been redacted to large animal, possibly ursine. The black fluid, the intelligent hunting behavior, the symbolic markings, all omitted as trauma-induced hallucinations. "So what do?" I asked, though part of me already knew her answer. "We go back." Her voice was steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "We document everything. Get evidence they can't ignore. Whatever these things are, they're escalating. More sightings, more missing persons. Something's changing." I wanted to refuse, to walk away from the coffee shop and never look back, to pretend that night in the forest had been nothing more than a shared delusion. But the slug in my pocket, deformed, double-width, coated in something darker than shadow, reminded me that some truths can't be escaped. "When?" The word felt like surrender. "Tomorrow. The search parties have moved north. We'll have the eastern quadrant to ourselves." I nodded, already calculating what we'd need. Better weapons, cameras with night vision capability, satellite phones for when cell service failed. Not just survival gear, but hunting gear. Because this time, we wouldn't be the prey. The forest looked different in November. Leaves had fallen, leaving the trees skeletal against the slate-gray sky. Visibility extended further between trunks, though this provided little comfort. Anything watching us would have clearer sight lines as well. We parked at a designated trailhead, away from the logging spur where we'd camped in June. Different approach, different terrain, but the same ancient forest, stretching in all directions. Hannah shouldered her pack, the outline of a rifle visible beneath her coat. "We stay together," I reminded her. "No separating, no matter what we hear or see." She nodded grimly. We'd learned that lesson the hard way. The trail wound through bare oak and hickory, occasional pines providing the only green in a landscape drained of color. The recent disappearances had occurred approximately 3 miles in, near a rock formation locals called the Devil's Backbone, a series of weathered limestone outcroppings that resembled vertebrae protruding from the earth. We hiked in silence, senses hyper-alert to every snap of twig, every rustle of underbrush. Twice I caught myself reaching for the rifle slung across my back, certain I'd glimpsed movement in peripheral vision. Twice there was nothing there. Just shadows and memory playing tricks. The Devil's Backbone appeared ahead, pale stone stark against the darkening forest. Weather forecasts predicted an early sunset and possible snow. Already the air carried the metallic tang of approaching precipitation. We needed to work quickly. The missing hiker's campsite had been located in a small clearing beneath the largest outcropping. Yellow police tape still marked the perimeter, fluttering in the chill breeze. Beyond it, trampled ground and the scattered remnants of a hasty departure. A forgotten cooking pot, a single boot, a backpack torn open and contents strewn across dead leaves. They were taken at night, Hannah said, examining the 3-person tent that remained standing despite long slash marks across its fabric. Just like the others would have been, if they hadn't managed to fight back or escape. I crouched to examine tracks pressed into the soft ground near the tent entrance. The same distinctive prints we'd found along the creek bed in June. Too wide for coyote, toes spread like a hand pressed in mud, claws etching deep furrows. But these seemed larger somehow, the impression deeper, as if the creatures had grown. Or perhaps these were made by adults while we'd encountered juveniles. The thought sent ice through my veins. If those had been younger specimens, Caleb, Hannah called softly. Look up. I followed her gaze to the branches overhead. At first I saw nothing unusual, just bare limbs against gray sky. Then my eyes adjusted to the pattern, and horror bloomed cold in my chest. Every tree surrounding the clearing bore the same carved symbol. 3 vertical lines crossed by 2 horizontal. Dozens of them, some weathered and clearly years old, others fresh enough that pale wood showed through dark bark. The clearing was ringed with these markings, a boundary of ancient warnings. They knew, I whispered. The hikers camped in a marked territory. Hannah nodded. Look at the arrangement. The symbols all face inward, toward the campsite. Like they're not warnings to stay away, but boundaries to keep something in. Before I could respond, a sound cut through the forest silence. Branches breaking perhaps 100 yards distant, too heavy for deer or normal forest wildlife. We both froze, eyes scanning the trees, hands moving instinctively to our weapons. Silence returned, stretched for long minutes. Just as I began to relax, thinking we'd imagined it, Hannah clutched my arm. There, she whispered, pointing. Between trees, perhaps 50 yards away, stood a figure. Too distant for details, just a silhouette against the gray forest backdrop. But even at that distance, the wrongness was apparent. Too tall, too still, proportions that contradicted human anatomy. I raised my rifle, sighting through the scope. The figure remained motionless, as if awaiting this very action. Through magnification, details emerged, the familiar slate-gray fur, the hunched shoulders, the canine head with one amber eye, the same creature. The one I'd shot, the one that should have died from wounds no natural animal could survive. And beside it, half hidden behind a massive oak, the smaller ones we'd glimpsed during the attack on our camper. It's them, I breathed. The same pack. Hannah raised her camera, the shutter clicking rapidly. They're watching us, evaluating. The lead creature's head tilted in that unsettlingly inquisitive gesture I remembered too well. Its ruined eye socket had healed somewhat, though the fur around it remained matted with dried black fluid. It made no aggressive move, simply observed our presence with calculated intelligence. Then, with deliberate slowness, it raised one hand and pressed 3 fingers against the tree beside it. Claws dug into bark, carving with methodical precision. Even at this distance, I knew what symbol it created. It's marking us, Hannah whispered. Claiming us. The creature finished its carving, then looked directly at us again. Something like satisfaction radiated from its posture. It had delivered its message. Without hurry, it turned and walked deeper into the forest, the 2 smaller ones following without looking back. We stood frozen, hearts hammering against ribs, as silence once again claimed the clearing. The encounter had lasted perhaps 2 minutes, yet in those moments, everything had changed. This hadn't been a random encounter in June. We hadn't stumbled into their territory by accident. They had selected us then. They were selecting us now. We need to go, I said, voice hoarse. Now. Before dark. Hannah nodded, but made no move to leave. They're not going to attack us here, she said with strange certainty. Not in daylight. Not with the symbols all around. This place is special to them. All the more reason to leave, I urged, already backing toward the trail. Wait. She approached one of the marked trees, studying the carved symbol more closely. These aren't all the same. Look at the older ones. They have additional marks beneath, like a tally system. She was right. The weathered symbols, some clearly decades old based on how the bark had grown around them, included series of small notches beneath the main marking. I counted one that had 17 such notches. Another had 23. Years? I suggested. Kills? Hannah shook her head. I think they're counting cycles. The anthropologist I mentioned, he found journal entries from early settlers describing similar markings. They appear in 7-year intervals, always carved before winter, always followed by disappearances. A terrible suspicion formed. The 3 hikers last week, the first of this cycle, Hannah confirmed grimly. There will be more, unless someone stops it. The implication hung between us, unspoken but understood. We had witnessed what others had only glimpsed. We had survived an encounter that should have been fatal. Perhaps that marked us as special, as responsible. We can't fight them, I said, though the rifle in my hands contradicted my words. Not alone. No, Hannah agreed. But we can expose them. Document everything. Force authorities to acknowledge what's happening here. Break the cycle of denial that allows this to continue. Snow began to fall, sparse flakes spiraling down through bare branches. The forest grew darker as clouds thickened overhead. Night would arrive early, hastened by the storm. We needed to reach the trailhead before darkness gave the creatures their advantage. As we hiked back, footsteps hurried by approaching weather. I felt eyes following our progress, patient, calculating, certain. The creatures made no attempt to pursue or intercept. They didn't need to. They had marked us, claimed us. The hunt would continue on their terms, in their time. We reached the parking area as true darkness fell, snow now coming down in earnest. The drive back to Little Rock passed in tense silence, both of us processing what we'd seen, what it meant. The certainty that our encounter in June had been merely the opening chapter of a longer, darker story. Ranger Dillard met us at a diner off Highway 7 3 days later. He'd aged since summer. Deep lines etched around eyes that carried the same haunted awareness I now recognized in my own. He studied the photos Hannah had taken, the notes we'd compiled, with the weariness of a man confronting a familiar nightmare. You shouldn't have gone back, he said finally, pushing the materials away, untouched coffee growing cold between his weathered hands. You know what they are, Hannah said. Not a question. Dillard's gaze flicked to the window, to the forest-covered mountains visible in the distance. What they are doesn't matter. What matters is that they've been here longer than us. We'll be here after we're gone. He leaned forward, voice dropping. This isn't the first time someone's tried to expose them, to hunt them. It always ends the same way, with more disappearances, I guessed. More animal attacks in the official reports. He nodded grimly. They took my partner in '87. We'd found a pattern just like you. Thought we could end it. His fingers traced an unconscious pattern on the table, 3 vertical lines crossed by 2 horizontal. They let me live, to carry the message, to maintain the silence. And you've kept that silence for almost 40 years, Hannah said, accusation sharp in her voice. Dillard's eyes, when they met hers, held ancient grief. Because the alternative was worse. You think these 3 or 4 disappearances every few years are tragic. Imagine what happens if they feel truly threatened, if their territory is invaded by well-armed search parties, if their existence becomes public knowledge. The implication hung in the air between us. Not just predators, but territorial guardians of something older, something that required regular sacrifice to remain dormant. What's beneath the mountains? I asked, remembering the Cherokee legends Hannah had mentioned. What are they feeding? Dillard shook his head. Some questions shouldn't be answered. He rose, leaving money for his untouched coffee. My advice? Forget what you saw. Move away, far away. They marked you once, but distance and time might break that connection. Might. He paused at the door, snow swirling around his silhouette. Or do what I did. Join the Forest Service. Become a ranger. Make sure campers stay on designated sites, away from certain areas. Redirect search parties when needed. Maintain the balance that's kept things contained for centuries. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Hannah and I alone with our discovery. Our responsibility. We could leave, I suggested, though I already knew her answer. Already knew my own. Hannah's eyes, when they met mine, held grim determination beneath the fear. They'll keep hunting, Caleb. Keep taking people who don't know what they're walking into. Someone has to break the cycle. I nodded slowly, thinking of the slug I still carried. Deformed, double width, coated in something darker than shadow. Physical evidence of a truth too terrible to acknowledge yet too important to deny. Then we do it right, I said. We prepare, research, gather allies who've had similar experiences, find weaknesses, and we go back, Hannah finished. When we're ready. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the distant mountains in a deceptive blanket of pristine white. Somewhere beneath that innocent facade, ancient eyes watched and waited. The hunt had only just begun. I used to think madness belonged to drunks and poets. Now I know it runs on 4 legs through forests older than human memory. It walks upright when it chooses, thinks with terrible intelligence, and hunts with patient certainty. And sometimes, if you're both lucky and cursed, it lets you live long enough to understand what you've glimpsed at the edges of reality. Long enough to realize that some predators are also guardians, keeping ancient borders that were never meant to be crossed. The slug sits on my desk as I write this, a reminder and a promise. The Ouachita waits, its secrets preserved by those who walk wrong, who hang their kills in trees as offerings to something older than forests, older than mountains, something that hunger, even now, beneath our feet. When people ask why I chose this job, I usually tell them it's for the adventure, not because of a deep-seated desire to save lives or because I want to connect with nature. No. I picked search and rescue because it keeps things simple. I find people, I bring them home. That's the job. Sounds easy, right? It was until that day in late September 2008, out in the middle of Coconino National Forest, Arizona. I'm Pierce Gunnarsson, a no-nonsense, straight-talking guy. No kids, no wife. I'm a free agent, which helps, considering this job can pull you out of bed at 3 a.m. My life is simple, and that's the way I like it. Or at least, it used to be. The call came in on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes you forget winter exists. I was sitting in my truck outside the station, eating a sandwich and watching the clouds gather over the rim when the radio crackled to life. Missing persons report near the Mongolian Rim. 2 campers, last seen heading into the backcountry 3 days ago. 3 days. That was already pushing it. In my experience, people who've been missing that long are either dead or wish they were. But I kept that cheerful thought to myself as I radioed back my confirmation. The drive to the last known location took me deep into the forest, past the tourist areas and into the places where cell towers don't reach, and the trees grow so thick they block out the sky. The deeper I went, the more the landscape changed. What started as familiar hiking trails gave way to ancient game paths, and those eventually disappeared entirely into wilderness that looked like it hadn't been disturbed since the Ice Age. I'd been working these woods for 12 years, knew every major trail and most of the minor ones, but there were still places that felt wrong, areas where the trees grew too close together and the shadows fell at impossible angles, places where experienced hikers got turned around and seasoned hunters came back with stories they'd never repeat sober. The missing campers were a young couple from Phoenix. According to the report, they'd told friends they were planning a 3-day backpacking trip to get away from civilization. They'd picked the right place for it. The area they'd chosen was 20 miles from the nearest road, with terrain that could break an ankle or worse if you weren't careful. I parked my truck where the trail ended and shouldered my pack. The weight was familiar, comforting even. 60 pounds of gear that had pulled me through more rescues than I could count. First aid kit, emergency shelter, extra food and water, flares, rope, and my trusty GPS unit that had never let me down. The trail markers stopped after the first mile. From there, it was all instinct and experience. I followed the faint signs that most people would miss. A broken branch here, a disturbed patch of ground there. The couple had been smart enough to stick to the established path at first, but I could see where they'd started to deviate, probably thinking they'd found a shortcut or a more scenic route. Amateur mistake. The forest doesn't care about your schedule or your comfort level. It'll take you exactly as far as it wants to, and sometimes that's not far enough to find your way back. The temperature dropped as the sun sank lower, and I found myself checking my watch more frequently. I'd been walking for 2 hours with no sign of the missing campers except for the occasional footprint in the softer ground. The forest was eerily quiet, missing the usual sounds of wildlife that should have been preparing for evening feeding. No bird calls, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I'd experienced quiet forests before, but this felt different. This felt like the kind of silence that comes right before something terrible happens. The kind animals sense long before humans do, when they abandon an area and leave it to whatever's coming. I stopped to check my GPS coordinates against the map, trying to plot the most likely path the couple would have taken. That's when I noticed the scratch marks on the nearest tree, deep gouges in the bark, running from about waist height all the way up to where I couldn't reach. Too high for any animal I knew. Too deliberate to be accidental damage. The gouges were fresh, no more than a few days old. Sap was still oozing from the wounds, and when I touched it, it came away sticky and warm on my fingers. Whatever had made these marks had been here recently. I pulled out my radio and tried to call back to base, but got nothing but static. The terrain played hell with radio signals, and the thick canopy didn't help. I'd known this might happen, but it still made me feel isolated in a way I didn't like. The smart thing would have been to turn back, wait for daylight, and return with backup. But somewhere out there, 2 people were counting on me to find them. If they were still alive, they wouldn't last another night in the dropping temperatures. I pressed on, following the trail deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer together here, their branches intertwining overhead to form a natural tunnel that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. I had to use my flashlight even though sunset was still an hour away. The beam cut through the darkness ahead of me, illuminating patches of ground that looked increasingly disturbed, not just from human passage, but from something else. Something larger that had passed through recently, leaving broken branches and torn earth in its wake. I'd been tracking for long enough to recognize the signs of different animals. Bears left distinctive claw marks and disturbed vegetation in predictable patterns. Mountain lions were more subtle, but their tracks were unmistakable. Even elk and deer had their own signatures in the way they moved through the forest. This was none of those things. This was something else entirely. The smell hit me first. Sweet and rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. It was faint at first, just a hint carried on the evening breeze, but it grew stronger as I moved deeper into the forest. I'd smelled death before, both human and animal, but this was different. This was wrong in a way that made my stomach turn. I followed the scent, my flashlight beam dancing across the increasingly disturbed ground. Broken branches hung at unnatural angles, and the undergrowth was flattened in wide swaths that spoke of something massive moving through with complete disregard for the obstacles in its path. The trees here were different too. Ancient pines and oaks that should have been magnificent were instead twisted and gnarled, their bark scarred with the same deep gouges I'd seen earlier. Some of the marks were old, healed over with layers of sap and new growth. Others were fresh, still weeping resin that caught the light like tears. I found the first piece of camping gear about 50 yards off what remained of the trail. A torn piece of nylon fabric, bright blue against the dark earth. I knelt and examined it, noting the ragged edges and the way it had been shredded rather than cut. No knife or sharp rock had done this. The tears were too random, too violent. 20 feet further, I found a hiking boot. Just one, lying on its side next to a fallen log. The leather was torn, and dark stains covered the interior. When I picked it up, something wet and viscous dripped from the opening. I didn't look too closely at what it might be. The smell was stronger now, almost overwhelming. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and mouth, but it didn't help much. The stench seemed to penetrate everything, coating the back of my throat with its sickly sweetness. I found the campsite in a small clearing where the couple had obviously spent at least one night. The tent was still standing, but barely. The nylon walls were shredded, hanging in strips that fluttered in the slight breeze. Camping gear was scattered everywhere, most of it broken or torn beyond recognition. The sleeping bags had been dragged from the tent and ripped open, their synthetic filling scattered across the ground like snow. A camp stove lay upside down, its fuel canister punctured and leaking. The sharp smell of white gas mixed with the underlying odor of decay. I approached the tent carefully, my flashlight beam probing the darkness inside. The floor was stained with something dark that reflected the light like oil. I didn't want to know what it was, but I had to check. Had to be sure. The tent was empty, but the interior told a story I didn't want to read. The walls were splattered with dark stains that could only be blood. Long scratches ran from floor to ceiling, as if something with claws had been trapped inside and fought desperately to get out, or maybe to get in. I backed away from the tent, my heart hammering against my ribs. Whatever had happened here, it had been violent and terrifying. The couple had been taken, that much was clear. But taken by what? I started to circle the campsite, looking for tracks or signs of where they might have gone. The ground here was softer, more receptive to prints, and I found them easily enough. Human footprints, running, stumbling, desperate. They led away from the camp in a rough line toward the deeper forest, but they weren't the only tracks. Mixed in with the human prints were others, larger, deeper, with long claw marks extending from what might have been toe prints. They were almost like a big cat's tracks, but wrong in every detail. Too large, too deep. The spacing between them suggested a stride that no natural animal could achieve. I followed the trail, my flashlight beam jumping from print to print. The human tracks became more erratic, showing signs of panic and exhaustion. One set veered off to the right, disappearing into a thicket of thorn bushes. The other continued straight ahead, but the steps were getting shorter, more stumbling. I chose to follow the trail that led straight ahead, hoping it would lead me to at least one of the missing campers. The forest grew denser as I walked, the trees pressing in from all sides until I was practically pushing through branches with every step. The smell was getting stronger again, and I realized I was walking toward its source. My flashlight beam caught something pale in the distance, and I forced myself to move closer. I found him in a small clearing, lying in a twisted heap that had once been a man. The body was positioned at the base of a massive pine tree, limbs bent at impossible angles. His face was turned toward me, eyes wide open and staring, mouth frozen in a silent scream of absolute terror. The scratches and tears covering his body were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were too precise, too deliberate to be the result of a frenzied animal attack. It looked like something had been playing with him, testing different levels of damage, seeing how much he could take before he finally gave up. His clothes were shredded but not removed. Whatever had done this hadn't been interested in eating him. This had been about something else entirely. Something that enjoyed the act of killing more than the result. I forced myself to examine the body more closely, looking for clues about what had happened. The wounds were deep but not immediately fatal. He'd been alive for most of it, conscious enough to feel everything that was being done to him. The positioning of the injuries suggested he'd been held down, unable to escape or defend himself. I should have called for backup right then. Standard protocol demanded it, but my radio was still getting nothing but static, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the other camper might still be alive. Somewhere in this nightmare forest, a woman was counting on me to find her. I took pictures of the scene with my camera, documenting everything I could. The flash seemed impossibly bright in the darkness, and each burst of light revealed new details I wished I hadn't seen. The man's fingernails were torn and bloody, suggesting he'd fought back as best he could. The ground around him was churned up, showing signs of a struggle that had gone on for longer than I wanted to think about. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something else. The trees surrounding the clearing were marked with the same deep scratches I'd been seeing, but here they formed a pattern, not random damage, but deliberate markings, like territorial markers, or perhaps something else entirely, something that suggested intelligence behind the violence. I left the body where it was and continued following the second set of tracks. The woman's trail was easier to follow now, marked with torn pieces of clothing and drops of blood that looked black in the flashlight beam. She'd been running, but not randomly. Her path showed purpose, as if she knew where she was going. The forest felt different now. The oppressive silence had been replaced by something worse, the sense of being watched. I could feel eyes on me, tracking my movement through the trees. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound made me jump. I'd been doing search and rescue for 12 years, and I'd never felt anything like this. The forest had become actively hostile, a living thing that wanted me gone. The very air felt thick and wrong, as if it was fighting my attempts to breathe. But I kept walking, following the trail deeper into the darkness. Somewhere ahead, a woman was waiting for rescue, and something else was waiting too. I found her 40 minutes later, crouched at the base of a massive pine tree like a broken doll. She was rocking back and forth, her arms wrapped around her knees, muttering something under her breath in a voice so low I couldn't make out the words. She didn't look up when I approached, even when I spoke her name. Her clothes were torn and bloody, but she didn't seem to be seriously injured, at least not physically. The damage to her mind was another story entirely. "Ma'am, can you hear me? My name is Pierce. I'm with Search and Rescue." She stopped rocking for a moment, her head tilting slightly as if she was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then she looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. They were wide and unfocused, the pupils dilated despite the bright beam of my flashlight. "Fast," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's so fast." I knelt down beside her, trying to make myself less threatening. "You're safe now. I'm going to get you out of here." She shook her head violently, her hair whipping around her face. No. It's still out there. It's waiting. It knows we're here." "What's waiting? What did you see?" But she just kept repeating the same word over and over again. "Fast, fast, fast." Each repetition was a little louder, a little more desperate, until she was almost shouting it. I tried to calm her down, to get her to focus on me instead of whatever horror was playing out in her mind. But her eyes kept darting to the trees around us, following movements I couldn't see. Whatever she was looking at, it wasn't there for me, at least, not yet. I pulled out my radio and tried again to reach base, but the static was worse now. The interference was so bad it almost sounded like voices, whispers in a language I didn't recognize. I adjusted the frequency, trying to find a clear channel, but every setting brought only more static. "We need to move," I told her. "Can you walk?" She nodded, But when I helped her to her feet, she immediately collapsed again. Her legs were shaking too badly to support her weight, and her skin was cold and clammy. She was in shock, probably had been since whatever happened to her companion. I was trying to figure out how to carry her when she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Her fingers dug into my flesh like claws, and her eyes focused on mine with sudden, terrifying clarity. "It's coming," she whispered. "It knows you're here now. It can smell you." That's when I heard it. A sound like branches breaking, but too rhythmic to be natural, too deliberate. Something large was moving through the forest, and it was coming our way. The woman started shaking harder, her teeth chattering so loudly I could hear them clicking together. "Fast," she said again, but this time it wasn't a random repetition. This time it was a warning. I grabbed my knife from my belt. It was a good blade, sharp and strong, but looking at it now made me feel like a child with a toy sword. Whatever was coming for us, I had the feeling steel wouldn't be enough to stop it. The sound was getting closer. I could hear individual footsteps now, if you could call them that. They were too heavy, too widely spaced. Each impact sent vibrations through the ground that I could feel through my boots. "Stay behind me," I told the woman, though I wasn't sure what protection I could offer. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was the silence of a predator that had found its prey and was deciding when to strike. I swept my flashlight beam across the trees, looking for any sign of movement. The light seemed weaker now, barely penetrating the darkness beyond the first ring of trees, but I could see shapes moving just beyond the edge of the beam, shadows that didn't match the stationary trunks and branches. "Where are you?" I called out, hoping my voice sounded braver than I felt. The answer came as a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not quite a growl, not quite a roar, but something that combined the worst elements of both. It was a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight to the primitive part of my brain, the part that remembered when humans were prey animals hiding in caves. Then I saw it. At first it looked like a mountain lion, but wrong in every detail. It was bigger than any cat I'd ever seen, easily the size of a small bear. Its fur was matted and dirty, hanging in clumps that couldn't quite hide the unnatural length of its limbs. The proportions were all wrong, as if someone had taken a normal animal and stretched it on a rack. But the most disturbing thing was the way it moved. It didn't walk like a quadruped. Instead, it seemed to flow from one position to another, its body contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. One moment it was crouched on 4 legs, the next it was standing upright on 2, its front paws, or were they hands, reaching toward us with fingers that ended in claws like curved daggers. Its eyes reflected my flashlight beam, but they didn't glow with the simple shine of animal eyes. There was intelligence there, cunning and malevolent. It was studying us, calculating, planning. This wasn't a simple predator driven by hunger or territory. This was something that enjoyed the hunt for its own sake. The woman behind me started screaming, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. The creature's head tilted at the sound, and I swear I saw it smile. Not the baring of teeth that animals do, but an actual smile, lips pulling back to reveal rows of teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. I raised my knife, though I knew it was useless. The creature was at least 20 feet away, but I had the feeling it could cover that distance in a heartbeat. The woman had been right. It was fast, faster than anything natural had a right to be. "Stay back," I shouted, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to the creature or trying to convince myself I had some control over the situation. The creature took a step forward, and I saw how wrong I'd been about its size. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall when standing upright. Its muscle definition was visible even through the matted fur, and every movement spoke of power barely held in check. It was toying with us. It could have killed us already, but it was drawing out the moment, savoring our fear. The woman had stopped screaming, but I could hear her hyperventilating behind me. Her companion had probably made similar sounds before the end. The creature took another step, and I knew our time was up. I tensed my muscles, preparing to charge. It was suicide, but maybe I could distract it long enough for the woman to run. Maybe she could make it back to the trail, back to civilization, back to people who would believe her story. But as I prepared to attack, the creature did something I hadn't expected. It stopped, its head turning to the side as if listening to something. Then it looked back at us, and I saw something new in its eyes. Not hunger or malice, but something that might have been disappointment. It had been called away. Something else wanted its attention more than we did. The creature gave us one last look, and then it was gone. Not running, not stalking away, but simply gone. One moment it was there. The next it had vanished into the shadows, as if it had never existed. I stood there for a long moment, knife still raised, unable to believe we were still alive. The woman had gone quiet behind me, and when I turned to check on her, I saw she had fainted. Her body was slumped against the tree, but she was breathing. I knew we couldn't stay here. Whatever had called the creature away might not hold its attention for long. We needed to find shelter, somewhere we could wait for daylight and help. That's when I saw it, barely visible through the trees. A structure, man-made and abandoned. A ranger tower, probably left over from the days when the Forest Service had money for such things. It was our only chance. The ranger tower was a relic from another era, built in the days when fire lookouts were staffed by humans instead of satellites and sensors. It stood 30 feet tall, a simple wooden structure perched on stilts that had somehow survived decades of weather and neglect. I half-carried, half-dragged the woman across the uneven ground, expecting at any moment to hear the sound of pursuit. But the forest remained silent, which was almost worse than the creature's presence. At least when I could see it, I knew where the danger was. The tower's ladder was still intact, though several rungs were missing or rotted through. I went up first, testing each step before putting my full weight on it. The structure swayed slightly in the wind, but it felt solid enough. The lookout cabin at the top was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with windows on all sides and a door that hung crooked on its hinges. The floor was covered with debris, leaves, bird droppings, and the remains of what might have been a squirrel's nest, but the roof was intact, and the walls were solid. I climbed back down to get the woman. She was conscious again, but barely. Her eyes were unfocused, and she moved like a sleepwalker. I had to guide her hands to each rung of the ladder, practically pushing her up ahead of me. Once we were both inside, I secured the door as best I could. The original lock was long gone, but I found a piece of wood that I could wedge under the handle. It wouldn't stop a determined human, let alone whatever was hunting us, but it might buy us a few seconds. The woman collapsed in the corner, curling up in a ball with her back against the wall. She'd started muttering again, the same word over and over. Fast, fast, fast. It was like a mantra, or maybe a prayer. I checked my radio again, but the static was worse than ever. The interference was so bad it actually hurt to listen to, like feedback from a broken amplifier. I turned it off and tried to think of other options. My cell phone showed no bars, which wasn't surprising. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by mountains and thick forest. Even if I could get a signal, who would I call? The local sheriff? The Forest Service? What would I tell them? That a monster was hunting us? I inventored my gear, looking for anything that might help. Rope, first aid kit, emergency food and water, flares. The flares might be useful if I could get them lit and thrown far enough to distract the creature, but that would require going back outside, and I wasn't ready to risk that yet. The woman had gone quiet again, but she was still conscious. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. I tried to talk to her, to get her to focus on something other than whatever trauma was playing out in her mind. "What's your name?" I asked. She didn't answer at first, but then she whispered something so quietly I had to lean closer to hear it. "Camellia," she said. "My name is Camellia. Camellia, I'm Pierce. I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to help me. Can you tell me what happened?" She shook her head, not meeting my eyes. "You wouldn't believe me. Try me." She was quiet for a long moment, and I thought she'd retreated back into her shock. But then she started talking, her voice flat and emotionless, like she was reading from a script. "We were sleeping. It was our second night. Something woke me up, a sound like nails on a chalkboard, but deeper. I thought it was just an animal, maybe a bear getting into our food." She paused, her hands shaking as she pulled her knees closer to her chest. "I woke up John Beater. He said he'd heard it too. We got out of the tent to look around, and that's when we saw it. Standing at the edge of our camp, just watching us." "What did it look like?" "Like a cat, but wrong. Too big, too intelligent. It looked at us like it knew exactly what we were thinking, like it was enjoying our fear." I nodded, encouraging her to continue. John Beater grabbed a flashlight and shined it at the thing. It didn't run. It just stood there, looking back at us. Then it smiled. I swear to God, it smiled at us. She started rocking again, her voice getting higher and more frantic. John Beater threw a rock at it, trying to scare it away, but it just tilted its head like it was curious. Then it moved, so fast I couldn't follow it. 1 second it was 20 feet away, the next it was right in front of him. She stopped talking, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. I could see she was about to hyperventilate again. "It's okay," I said. "You're safe now. It can't get up here." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The creature had shown intelligence, and intelligence meant adaptability. If it wanted us badly enough, it would find a way. Sarah's breathing slowed, and she continued her story. "It didn't kill him right away. It played with him first, knocked him down, let him get up, knocked him down again, like a cat with a mouse. John Beater kept trying to fight back, but he might as well have been fighting a mountain." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warm air. I ran. I left him there and I ran. I could hear him screaming behind me, but I just kept running. I'm such a coward. You're not a coward, I told her. You survived. That's what matters. But she shook her head violently. It let me go. It wanted me to run. It was all part of the game. Before I could ask what she meant, I heard it. A sound like claws on wood, coming from below us. Something was at the base of the tower, and it was climbing. Sarah heard it too. Her eyes went wide, and she pressed herself further into the corner. It followed us, she whispered. It knew we'd come here. The scratching sound got closer, accompanied by a creaking that suggested the tower was swaying under additional weight. I looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness below. Then something slammed into the side of the tower, hard enough to shake the entire structure. The windows rattled in their frames, and dust fell from the ceiling. Whatever was down there, it was testing the tower's stability. Another impact, this one from the other side. The tower swayed more noticeably, and I heard wood splintering somewhere below us. The creature was systematically attacking the support structure, trying to bring the whole thing down. I grabbed my knife and positioned myself between Camellia and the door. If the creature made it up here, I'd try to buy her time to escape. Though where she could go from 30 feet up, I had no idea. The impact stopped suddenly, and the tower stopped swaying. The silence was deafening, broken only by Camelia's ragged breathing and the thundering of my own heart. Then I heard it on the roof. Footsteps, but wrong somehow. Too heavy, too deliberate. It was up there, walking around directly above us. Dust fell from the ceiling with each step, and I could see the wooden beams flexing under the weight. Sarah had gone completely silent, not even breathing as far as I could tell. We both stared at the ceiling, following the sound of the creature's movement. It was pacing back and forth, like a predator in a cage. Suddenly, one of the ceiling boards cracked, not enough to break through, but enough to show that the wood was under more stress than it could handle. The creature was testing the roof, looking for weak points. I knew we didn't have much time. The tower was old, and it hadn't been designed to support something that heavy. If the creature kept applying pressure, it would eventually break through. I looked around the cabin, desperate for anything that might help. That's when I saw the trapdoor in the floor. It was partially hidden under debris, but I could make out the outline of a square cut in the floorboards. I cleared away the debris as quietly as I could, revealing a wooden panel with a rusty metal handle. It was probably an access hatch for maintenance, leading down into the tower's interior structure. It wasn't much, but it might give us another option if the creature broke through the roof. I lifted the panel carefully, wincing as it creaked on old hinges. Below was a narrow space filled with wooden beams and metal cables, the tower's internal framework. The footsteps above us stopped. In the sudden silence, I realized the creature had heard the trapdoor opening. It knew we were planning something. The silence stretched on, becoming almost unbearable. Then, without warning, the creature let out that sound again, the grinding, metallic roar that seemed to come from somewhere deep in its chest. It was a sound of frustration, of hunger, of something that had been denied its prey for too long. The attack, when it came, was explosive. The creature slammed into the roof with what must have been its full weight, and the wooden beams cracked like gunshots. Sarah screamed, and I saw a claw break through the ceiling, followed by another. The creature was tearing its way through the roof, splinters of wood flying everywhere. In the gaps between the boards, I could see something moving, a glimpse of matted fur and gleaming eyes. I grabbed Camellia and pulled her toward the trapdoor. "We're going down," I told her. "Move." She didn't argue. Together, we dropped through the opening into the tower's interior just as the creature finally broke through the roof. I heard it land in the cabin above us with a thud that shook the entire structure. We were in a narrow space between the tower's inner and outer walls, surrounded by wooden beams and metal cables. It was dark and cramped, but it was better than being in the same room as that thing. Above us, I could hear the creature moving around the cabin, searching for us. It made frustrated sounds, like a cat that had lost track of a mouse, but it knew we were still here somewhere. It was just a matter of time before it found us. I looked around our hiding place, trying to find another way out. The tower's structure was more complex than I'd realized, with multiple levels and access points. If we could make it to the bottom, we might be able to get back outside and run. But the creature was smart. It had probably already thought of that. It might be waiting for us at the bottom, or it might have positioned itself to cut off our escape route. Still, we couldn't stay here. The creature would eventually figure out where we were, and then we'd be trapped with nowhere to run. I helped Camellia navigate the narrow space, guiding her toward what looked like another access panel. Behind us, the sounds of the creature's search grew more frantic. It was losing patience. We reached the panel, and I slowly lifted it. Beyond was the tower's main support structure, a maze of wooden beams and metal brackets. If we could make it through without making noise, we might be able to reach the ground level. But as I started to climb through the opening, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The creature had found the trapdoor. It was coming after us. The creature's pursuit through the tower's interior was like being chased by a nightmare made manifest. I could hear it behind us, its claws scraping against wood and metal as it navigated the same narrow passages we were using. But where we had to squeeze and crawl, it seemed to flow like liquid darkness, its impossible anatomy allowing it to move through spaces that should have been too small. Camellia was moving on pure adrenaline now, her earlier shock replaced by desperate determination. She followed me through the maze of support beams without question, trusting me to find a way out. I only hoped I could live up to that trust. The tower's structure was more complex than I'd initially thought. There were multiple levels, each with its own access points and maintenance areas. We climbed down through a vertical shaft that had probably been used for running electrical cables, our hands and knees scraping against rough wood and rusty metal. Behind us, the creature's sounds grew closer. It was learning the tower's layout, adapting its pursuit to our route. Whatever intelligence guided it was far more sophisticated than any animal I'd ever encountered. We reached what I hoped was the bottom level, a cramped space filled with the tower's foundational supports. Through gaps in the wooden framework, I could see the forest floor about 10 feet below us. We were close to escape, but we'd have to go outside to reach the ground. I found an access panel that led to the tower's exterior ladder. It was our best shot at getting down safely, but it would also expose us to attack. The creature might be waiting outside, or it might follow us down the ladder. Either way, we couldn't stay here. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer, and I could hear wood splintering as the creature forced its way through obstacles. I opened the panel carefully, peering out into the darkness. The forest was quiet, but that didn't mean anything. The creature had proven it could move silently when it wanted to. "I'm going out first," I whispered to Camellia. "Wait for my signal, then follow. If something happens to me, run toward the trail. Don't look back." She nodded, her face pale but determined. Whatever breakdown she'd had earlier, she was fighting through it now. Survival instinct had taken over. I climbed through the opening onto the tower's exterior ladder. The wooden rungs felt solid enough, but I tested each one before putting my full weight on it. The last thing we needed was to fall and break something when we were so close to escape. The climb down seemed to take forever. Every shadow could hide the creature. Every sound could be the beginning of an attack. But I made it to the bottom without incident and gestured for Sarah to follow. She started down the ladder, moving carefully but steadily. She was about halfway down when I heard it, a sound like wood exploding, coming from inside the tower. The creature had reached the bottom level and was tearing through the walls to get to us. "Move!" I shouted, abandoning stealth for speed. Camellia dropped the remaining distance, landing hard but staying on her feet. We ran away from the tower, crashing through the underbrush without regard for noise or direction. Behind us, I could hear the creature emerge from the tower, its roar of frustration echoing through the forest. We ran blindly through the darkness, branches whipping at our faces and roots trying to trip us. I'd lost my flashlight somewhere in the tower, and we were navigating by moonlight and instinct alone. The creature was following us, but it wasn't rushing. It knew the forest better than we did, and it probably knew where we were going before we did. It was herding us, driving us toward some predetermined destination. I tried to change direction to break out of whatever pattern it was forcing us into, but the terrain worked against us. Thick stands of trees blocked our path, forcing us to follow natural corridors that led deeper into the forest. Camellia stumbled, and I caught her before she fell. She was exhausted, running on nothing but adrenaline and fear. I knew she couldn't keep this pace much longer, but I also knew we couldn't stop. "I can't," she gasped, her breathing ragged. "I can't run anymore." "You have to," I told her. "It's still behind us." But even as I said it, I realized something had changed. The sounds of pursuit had stopped. The forest was quiet again, but this time it felt different. Not the expectant silence of a predator about to strike, but the cautious quiet of animals sensing that danger had passed. We stopped running, both of us breathing hard. I looked back the way we'd come, but saw nothing in the darkness. The creature was gone, but I didn't trust its absence. "Why did it stop?" Camellia whispered. "I didn't know, but I had a theory." We'd been running for what felt like hours, but it had probably only been minutes. In that time, we'd covered a lot of ground, moving away from the creature's territory and toward areas where other people might be. The creature was intelligent, and intelligence meant caution. It wouldn't risk exposing itself to potential witnesses or investigators. It preferred to hunt in isolation, where it could take its time and avoid complications. "We need to keep moving," I said. "Find the trail and get back to civilization." But finding the trail in the darkness was easier said than done. I'd lost my GPS unit along with my flashlight, and the forest looked the same in every direction. We could be walking in circles, or we could be heading deeper into the wilderness. Camellia was struggling to keep up, her earlier burst of energy fading. She'd been through more trauma than anyone should have to endure, and her body was shutting down in response. "I need to rest," she said, leaning against a tree. "Just for a minute." I wanted to keep moving, but I could see she was at the end of her strength. If I pushed her too hard, she might collapse completely, and if that happened, I'd have to choose between staying with her or going for help. "5 minutes," I said. "Then we move again." She nodded gratefully, sliding down the tree trunk to sit on the ground. I remained standing, scanning the darkness for any sign of the creature. The forest was starting to feel normal again, filled with the small sounds of insects and night birds that had been absent during our ordeal, but I wasn't ready to trust that normalcy. The creature had shown too much intelligence, too much cunning. It might be waiting for us to relax our guard before striking again. "Tell me about the trail," I said, trying to keep Camellia focused. "How did you and John Beater get here?" She thought for a moment, her mind obviously struggling to process recent events. "We parked at the trailhead near Miller Creek, hiked in on the main trail for about 6 miles, then turned off onto a smaller path that John Beater found on his GPS. Miller Creek. I knew that area. It was about 8 miles from where we'd started, but in rough terrain that could take hours to navigate. Still, it was a destination, something to aim for." "Do you remember which direction you turned off the main trail?" I asked. "North, I think, or maybe northeast. John Beater was the one with the compass. It wasn't much to go on, but it was better than wandering randomly. If we could find the main trail, we could follow it back to the trailhead. From there, it would be a short hike to my truck." "Time to move," I said, helping Camellia to her feet. We started walking again, trying to maintain a steady pace without exhausting ourselves. The forest was slowly becoming more familiar, the trees and terrain matching my memories of the area. We were heading in the right direction. It took us 3 hours to find the main trail, and another 2 to reach the trailhead. By the time we saw the parking area, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. My truck was where I'd left it, dusty but intact. Camellia collapsed in the passenger seat while I started the engine, my hands shaking with exhaustion and relief. We drove in silence back to town, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I dropped Camellia off at the hospital, where she could get the medical attention she needed. She'd have to deal with the psychological trauma later, but at least she was alive. I went home, showered, and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's face, its impossible anatomy and malevolent intelligence. I'd write my report, following standard procedure, but I knew what parts I'd have to leave out. Who would believe me? A monster in the forest, something that defied natural law and hunted humans for sport? They'd think I was suffering from shock, or that I'd been drinking on the job, so I'd stick to the facts that could be verified. 2 campers missing, 1 found dead, 1 rescued alive. Cause of death, animal attack. The details would be vague, clinical, safe, but I'd know the truth, and I'd never go back to that part of the forest again. Some things you just don't mess with. Out there in the wild, it's not always about survival. Sometimes it's about knowing when to run, when to accept that you're not the apex predator you thought you were. I'd learned that lesson the hard way, and I'd carry it with me for the rest of my life. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the depths of Coconino National Forest, waiting for the next pair of hikers to wander off the trail, waiting for the next opportunity to hunt, and there was nothing I could do about it except hope that the next search and rescue team would be luckier than I was, or smarter. When I finally filed my report, I sat at my desk for a long time afterward, staring at the sanitized version of events I'd created. It was all true, as far as it went, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that something was living in those woods, something that shouldn't exist, something that had turned a simple rescue mission into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. I threw my gear in the back of my truck and sat on the tailgate, looking out at the forest in the distance. I laughed, but not because anything was funny. I laughed because what else was I supposed to do? They'd probably send another team out there eventually, when the next campers went missing, but it wouldn't be me. I'd make sure of that. Some searches aren't worth the risk. Some things are better left unfound, and some monsters are better left alone in the dark, where they belong. My name is David Salazar, and this happened to me back in 2017 in the White River National Forest, Colorado. The memories don't fade like normal ones should. They stay razor sharp, cutting into my mind during quiet moments when I let my guard down. The therapist says writing it down might help. I doubt it, but I'm out of options. We'd planned the trip for months. Just a simple outing. Me, my older brother Marco, and my 12-year-old daughter Isabel. A one-day loop to Nolan Lake and back. Nothing we hadn't done before. Nothing that should have gone wrong. The drive up from Denver took longer than expected. Road construction, then a detour through winding mountain passes that made Isabel queasy. By the time we parked our rented Winnebago on the gravel turnoff, dusk was settling into the valleys. The original plan, start at dawn, finish by sunset, was already compromised. We should wait until morning, Marco said, staring up at the darkening sky. His face caught the last light, highlighting the scar that ran from his left eye to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from his time in Afghanistan. Night hiking is stupid, David, I wanted to argue, but he was right. The mountains have their own logic after dark. Trails that seem obvious in daylight become treacherous puzzles under moonlight. So we settled in, Marco taking the fold-out couch, Isabel claiming the tiny bedroom, and me stretching out across the dining bench that converted to a bed that was 2 inches too short for my frame. That night, I dreamed of running. Not the pleasant kind where your feet barely touch the ground, but the desperate, lungs-burning flight of prey. I woke with sweat-soaked sheets tangled around my legs and a strange copper taste in my mouth. Outside, something moved in the brush, probably a deer or raccoon, but my heart hammered nonetheless. Dawn arrived with the mountains, smelling of pine sap and cold stone, the sort of scent that makes you think nothing bad can reach you up there, the kind of clean that feels like absolution. Marco busied himself with breakfast, powdered eggs and instant coffee, camping cuisine at its finest. Isabel sat cross-legged on a flat rock, her camera already out, snapping pictures of a blue jay that had taken interest in our crumbs. You sleep okay? Marco asked, not looking up from the small propane stove. Fine, I lied. You? He shrugged. Heard something moving around out there. Probably nothing, but there was tension in his shoulders that wasn't usually there. Marco had developed an almost preternatural sense for danger during his 3 tours. When he was on edge, it was wise to pay attention. We packed light. I carried my Ruger Scout Point .308. Marco toted his dad-gifted Remington shotgun, and Isabel swung her little camera like a badge of adventure. The guns weren't for anything specific, just standard precaution in bear country. At least, that's what we told Isabel. The truth was more complicated. The previous summer, a hiker had gone missing on the very trail we were taking. Search and rescue found his backpack, shredded and empty of food, but never found him. Officials blamed it on a rogue bear, but the incident report I'd found online mentioned details that didn't fit. Strange tracks, no blood evidence, and claw marks too wide for any recorded ursine species in Colorado. The trail started gentle enough, winding through dense ponderosa pines that filtered the morning sunlight into golden shafts. Isabel skipped ahead, her dark ponytail bouncing with each step. She was fearless in that way only children can be, untouched by the shadows that experience casts over everything. She looks more like Anna every day, Marco said quietly, using my late wife's name with the careful reverence people reserve for the dead. Yeah. The word came out rough. Anna had been gone 5 years now. Cancer that started in her breast and spread with ruthless efficiency to her bones, her liver, her brain. Isabel had been 7 when she died, old enough to understand but young enough to still expect miracles. You're doing good with her, Marco continued. Anna would be proud. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Marco had been my rock after Anna died, moving into our spare room for 6 months to help with Isabel, with the grief that threatened to drown me. If I was doing good, it was largely because of him. By mid-morning, we reached Nolan Lake. It sat in a natural bowl carved by ancient glaciers, the water so clear you could see 20 feet down to where trout hovered like living shadows. Isabel immediately began photographing the wildflowers that ringed the shoreline, columbines and Indian paintbrush creating splashes of purple and red against the green. We ate lunch on sun-warmed rocks, peanut butter sandwiches and trail mix. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the occasional call of an osprey circling overhead. This was why we came to the mountains, to find that quiet center that city life erodes. There's an abandoned fire watch cabin up there, I said, pointing to a ridge about a mile further. It's on the old maps, built in the 30s, during the CCC days. Thought we might check it out. Isabel perked up. Can I take pictures inside? Sure, Misha. The Spanish endearment slipped out naturally, though my own Spanish was rudimentary at best. Another legacy from Anna, who had spoken it fluently. Marco squinted up at the ridge. That's off trail, isn't it? A little. There's an old maintenance path that should get us there. He frowned. How far off? Half mile, tops. We'll still make it back to the RV well before dark. Marco nodded, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. He'd always been the cautious one between us, even before the military honed that trait to a razor's edge. I'd always been the one pushing boundaries, taking risks. Usually, it was fine. Usually, the maintenance path was overgrown but visible enough to follow. A narrow track that switchbacked up the steep slope. The forest changed as we climbed, ponderosis giving way to lodgepole pines and then to spruce and fir. The air thinned, and Isabel's cheeks flushed with exertion. "You okay?" I asked her during a water break. She nodded, too breathless to speak but smiling. That was Isabel, determined to keep up, to prove herself strong. Sometimes I worried that losing her mother so young had accelerated her growing up, robbed her of some essential childhood innocence. As we neared the ridge, a peculiar silence settled over the forest. No bird calls, no rustling underbrush, just the sound of our boots on rocky soil and our increasingly labored breathing. Even the wind seemed to have paused. I didn't recognize the unease for what it was then, the forest holding its breath in fear. The cabin appeared suddenly as we crested the ridge, a simple square structure with a peaked roof, weathered gray by decades of mountain winters. One window remained intact, the other was a jagged-edged hole. Sunlight struck the glass jaggedly, creating prismatic flashes that seemed oddly deliberate, like signals. "Cool," Isabel whispered, lifting her camera. Marco moved forward cautiously, shotgun held low but ready. I didn't comment on his weariness. There was something about the cabin that set my own nerves jangling. It looked wrong somehow. Not just abandoned, but violated. The door hung partially open. The wood around the hinges splintered as if it had been forced. Marco pushed it wider with the barrel of his shotgun, revealing a single room with a rusted metal cot, a toppled table, and a pot-bellied stove with its door yawning open like a black mouth. Inside, the air smelled rank, as if something wild had been bedding there. Claw marks, 5 long chisels, striped the doorframe. Not bear claws. Those would be more rounded, less precise. These were almost surgical in their straightness. Isabel stepped forward, her camera already raised, but I put a hand on her shoulder. "Wait," I said. "Let me check it out first." The floorboards creaked ominously under my weight. In one corner lay a pile of gnawed bones, deer mostly, judging by the slender leg bones, but also what looked disturbingly like a human-sized femur. I nudged it with my boot, hoping Isabel wouldn't notice. "What's that?" she asked, of course noticing immediately. "Deer bones," I said, telling a partial truth. "Something's been using this place as a den." Marco examined the claw marks on the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "These are fresh," he said quietly. "Maybe a week old." "Mountain lion?" I suggested, though I knew better. He shook his head. "Wrong pattern. Too wide." I felt a heaviness settle on my tongue, a metallic taste like fear. "Let's head back," I said. "I don't like this." We left the cabin without taking any photos, Isabel for once not protesting. As we descended the ridge, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something watching us from the cabin's empty window. There was nothing there, just darkness and a sense of wrongness that clung to us like cobwebs. The forest remained unnaturally quiet on our descent. Even our footfalls seemed muffled, as if the ground itself was absorbing sound. Isabel stayed between us now, no longer ranging ahead as she had on the ascent. She sensed it too, the shift in atmosphere, the presence of something unseen. "Dad?" she said softly. "I don't like it here anymore." "We're heading back, Mija," I assured her. "We'll be at the RV before you know it." But I was lying, and part of me already knew it. Because in wilderness like this, distance isn't measured in miles but in boundaries crossed, and we had stepped over an invisible line into territory that wasn't ours. Something had noticed us, marked us, and it was already too late to uncross that line. Around noon, the ridge opened to a meadow chewed to ruin. The grass lay flat in twisted whorls, as if a massive weight had rolled across it repeatedly. In the center, an elk lay in ribbons, ribs snapped, head twisted backward at an impossible angle. Flies hadn't found it yet. The kill was fresh, perhaps only hours old. "Jesus," Marco whispered, instinctively moving in front of Isabel to block her view. But she'd already seen it, her face draining of color. I moved closer, rifle ready. The carcass had been systematically dismembered, but not eaten, not completely. The choicest parts, the liver, the heart, the tender flank meat, were gone, but the rest remained, as if whatever killed it was selective, deliberate in its consumption. This wasn't predation for survival. This was something else. The prints surrounding the carcass looked like wolf tracks, stretched by some cruel joke. Wide forepads tapering to almost human-like heels. Some measured nearly 14 inches long. Larger than any wolf print I'd ever seen. Larger than should be biologically possible. Marco nudged one with his boot. "How does anything walk on that?" His voice was steady, but I could see the tightness around his eyes, the way his fingers curled more firmly around his shotgun. I had no answer for him. The tracks defied explanation, defied natural law. They spoke of something that should not exist, could not exist, yet clearly did. "Dad?" Isabel's voice was small, frightened. "Can we go? Please?" "Yeah, baby. We're going." I pulled her close, feeling her trembling against me. "Let's move." We kept moving quicker now, Isabel sandwiched between us, our weapons held ready. The sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its westward slide, shadows lengthening across the trail. We needed to make better time if we wanted to reach the RV before dark. On the descent, we lost the trail for half an hour and argued in low voices about whose compass reading was right. Marco insisted we needed to head due west, while my topographic map suggested a more northwestern route would intersect with the main trail. The tension ratcheted higher with each passing minute, our voices taking on an edge that frightened Isabel more than the elk carcass had. That was when the forest went silent, the birds quitting all at once as if someone had pressed a switch. The sudden absence of sound was more alarming than any noise could have been, a vacuum that pressed against our eardrums with almost physical force. Isabel noticed first. She lifted a finger, eyes wide, but before she spoke, a barking snarl rolled through the trees. Not a bear, not a cougar. Something that carried a shape of language but no words. The sound raised the hair on the back of my neck, sent ice water trickling down my spine. "Move," Marco hissed, pushing Isabel ahead of him. Now, we abandoned stealth for speed, crashing through underbrush, sliding down scree slopes, our boots sending small avalanches of pebbles ahead of us. The sound came again, closer this time, a guttural howl that seemed to contain multitudes, rage, hunger, and something that sounded disturbingly like laughter. "It's hurting us," Marco panted as we paused behind a massive boulder. Pushing us east, I checked my compass with shaking hands. He was right. We'd veered well off our intended course, driven by blind panic into unfamiliar territory. The sun was now hidden behind the western peaks, the forest rapidly descending into twilight. Getting back to the RV before dark was no longer possible. "We need to find shelter," I said. "Somewhere defensible." Marco nodded grimly. "There's a rock formation about 200 yards that way." He pointed south. "Saw it when we were coming up. Might give us some cover." Isabel clung to my hand, her palms slick with sweat. "Is it a bear, Dad?" she whispered. "I don't think so, Mija." I couldn't bring myself to lie to her. Not now. "But we're going to be okay, I promise." Another sound then. A heavy body moving through brush, branches snapping under significant weight. Close, too close. Perhaps 50 yards and closing. "Run," Marco said simply. And we did. The rock formation was a jumble of car-sized boulders, probably deposited by some ancient glacial retreat. They formed a natural fortress of sorts, with one particularly large slab creating a partial roof over a space big enough for the three of us to huddle in. Marco immediately began gathering smaller rocks to build a partial wall across the open side. "Help me," he ordered, and Isabel and I complied, stacking stones as quickly as we could. The activity gave Isabel something to focus on besides fear, her small hands working feverishly alongside ours. Darkness fell completely as we worked, the moon not yet risen. I flicked on my headlamp, its beam cutting a pale swath through the gathering gloom. In its light, Isabel's face looked ghostly, all huge eyes and taut skin. "It'll be okay," I told her again, trying to believe it myself. "We'll stay here tonight and head back to the RV at first light." Marco finished the wall, leaving just a narrow gap that would force anything trying to enter to squeeze through, a choke point we could defend. He positioned himself by this gap, shotgun resting across his knees. "I'll take first watch," he said. "You two try to get some sleep." I wanted to protest. It should have been me taking the first shift, but something in his expression stopped me. This was the Marco who had led men in combat, who had made life-or-death decisions in the worst possible circumstances. This was the Marco who knew what he was doing. So I nodded and settled back against the cold stone, pulling Isabel against me. I draped my jacket over her, though the night wasn't particularly cold. She curled into me like she used to as a toddler, small and vulnerable. "Try to sleep," I murmured, stroking her hair. "I can't," she whispered back. "I keep hearing things." I heard them too. Rustlings in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig. Sounds that could have been innocent nocturnal wildlife but felt deliberately ominous. Whatever had been tracking us was still out there, circling, waiting. "Tell me a story," Isabel said suddenly, like Mom used to. The request caught me off guard, opening an old wound. Anna had been the storyteller between us, spinning elaborate bedtime tales for Isabel featuring brave princesses and clever foxes. My stories were always too literal, too structured. Engineering problems with clear solutions, not the open-ended adventures Isabel craved. "Once upon a time," I began awkwardly. There was a girl who could talk to birds. What was her name? Isabel, I said, and felt her smile against my chest. Isabel could understand the language of birds, and they told her all the secrets of the forest. I continued the story, making it up as I went along, my voice low so as not to carry beyond our stone shelter. Isabel's breathing gradually slowed, her body relaxing against mine as she drifted toward sleep. Marco sat motionless by the gap in our wall, his silhouette sharp against the slightly lighter darkness outside. I must have dozed off eventually, because I snapped awake to Marco's hand on my shoulder, his finger pressed to his lips in the universal sign for silence. Isabel slept on, exhaustion having finally claimed her. Something's out there, Marco breathed, his mouth close to my ear. Circling, I eased Isabel off my chest and onto the ground, covering her with my jacket before taking up my rifle and crawling to the gap. Outside, the moon had risen, bathing the forest in silvery light that transformed familiar shapes into alien geometries. I strained my eyes and ears, searching for whatever had alarmed Marco. At first, nothing. Then, a shadow detached itself from a tree trunk about 30 yards away. Tall, impossibly tall, moving with a fluid grace that defied its size. It paused in a patch of moonlight, and I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a massive canine head atop a body that was all wrong. Too elongated, too upright. My breath caught in my throat. The rifle suddenly felt like a toy in my hands, inadequate protection against whatever this was. Beside me, Marco's knuckles whitened around his shotgun. The creature lifted its head, testing the air. I knew it could smell us, our sweat, our fear, our essential humanity. It took a step toward our shelter, then another. If it comes for us, Marco whispered, I'll hold it off. You take Isabel and run. I'm not leaving you. I hissed back. You will if it means saving her. I couldn't argue with that. Isabel's safety trumped everything, even my brother's life, even my own. The creature took another step forward, moonlight gleaming on what looked like wet fangs. Then, abruptly, it stiffened, head swiveling toward the north. A moment later, I heard it too. Voices, distant but distinct. Other hikers, maybe a search party. The creature hesitated, caught between its prey in the stone shelter and the new potential targets. Then it melted back into the shadows, moving with that same unnatural fluidity toward the voices. God help them, Marco muttered. We listened, tense and helpless, but heard no screams, no sounds of conflict. Eventually the voices faded, moving away from both us and the creature. Maybe they'd been lucky. Maybe the thing had decided we were easier targets and had circled back toward us. There was no way to know. We remained vigilant until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Isabel woke as the first birds began their tentative morning calls. Did it come back? She asked immediately, proving she'd been aware of more than I'd thought. No, I lied. We're fine, and now we're going to head back to the RV, okay? She nodded, accepting the lie because she needed to. We gathered our meager supplies and stepped out of our stone fortress into the deceptive tranquility of early morning. The forest looked innocent in the growing light, showing no sign of the horror that had stalked us through the night, but we knew better now. And as we oriented ourselves and began the trek back toward the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being allowed to leave, that our escape was a temporary reprieve, not a victory. I was right. We hiked in tense silence, moving as quickly as Isabel's shorter legs would allow. The forest seemed normal again, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the occasional rustle of larger animals moving away from our approach. But the peace felt tenuous, a thin veneer over something rotten. Marco led the way, his military training evident in the way he scanned our surroundings, alert to any hint of danger. I brought up the rear, constantly checking behind us, the nape of my neck prickling with the sensation of being watched. Isabel stayed between us, her camera forgotten in its case. By my estimation, we were about 2 miles from the RV when we found the backpack. It lay in the middle of the trail, torn and muddied but clearly recent. The fabric still bright, the zippers uncorroded. Marco approached it cautiously, nudging it with his boot before kneeling to examine it more closely. Daypack, he reported. High-end stuff. North Face. Someone dropped it? Isabel asked hopefully. Marco and I exchanged glances over her head. The pack hadn't been dropped, it had been ripped from someone's back with enough force to tear the reinforced straps. Dark stains spattered one side. Dried blood, though I didn't point this out to Isabel. Maybe, I said. Let's keep moving. But Marco was already rifling through the pack's contents. Driver's license, he said, holding up a wallet. Gerald Thompson, Denver address. Dated this year. Recent, I murmured. Marco nodded grimly. There's a park entrance receipt in here, dated yesterday. Yesterday. The knowledge sat like a stone in my stomach. Someone else had been in these woods very recently, and they hadn't made it out with their backpack. I thought of the voices we'd heard in the night, wondered if Gerald Thompson had been among them. "We should report this when we get back," I said, taking the wallet from Marco and tucking it into my own pack. "Come on." We continued on, the discovery adding urgency to our already hurried pace. The terrain began to look familiar. We were approaching the section of trail where we'd originally veered off toward the Firewatch cabin. The RV was perhaps an hour away now, less if we maintained our current pace. "I need to pee," Isabel announced suddenly. I hesitated, not wanting to stop even briefly. But nature's call couldn't be ignored indefinitely. "Okay, but make it quick. Marco and I will wait right here." She nodded and moved a few yards off the trail behind a large bush, still within sight, but with a modicum of privacy. Marco and I stood guard, back to back, scanning the forest. "When we get back," Marco said quietly, "we need to report everything. The cabin, the elk, the tracks, and Thompson's pack. They'll think we're crazy. Maybe. But if that thing's hunting in these woods, people need to know." He was right, of course. Whatever the consequences to our credibility, we couldn't in good conscience stay silent. Not if it meant other hikers might wander into the same nightmare we had. "Isabel?" I called, suddenly aware that she'd been gone for longer than necessary. "You okay?" No answer. "Isabel?" Louder now, alarm creeping into my voice. Marco was already moving toward the bush where she'd disappeared, shotgun raised. I followed, heart hammering against my ribs. She wasn't there. The ground behind the bush showed signs of a brief struggle. Disturbed earth, a small footprint, then larger, elongated prints that couldn't have been human. A few yards further, Isabel's blue windbreaker hung from a spruce limb, torn along one sleeve. "Isabel!" My scream echoed through the trees, returning to me empty. Marco grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "Quiet," he hissed. "You'll bring it right to us." But I was beyond reason, terror overwhelming any sense of self-preservation. My daughter was gone, taken by the same creature that had stalked us through the night. Nothing else mattered. "Isabel!" I screamed again, wrenching free of Marco's grip. He slapped me, hard enough to snap my head back. The shock of it cut through my panic, brought me crashing back to a clarity that was almost worse. "Listen to me," Marco said, his face inches from mine. "We'll find her, but not if we're dead. So get it together, right now." I nodded, my cheek stinging, tears blurring my vision. "Okay," I managed. "Okay, good. Now let's track this thing." Marco had been a scout in the army, trained to read terrain, to follow the faintest signs of passage. Now he applied those skills with grim intensity, moving through the underbrush with a hunter's focus. I followed close behind, rifle ready, senses straining for any hint of Isabel. The tracks led away from the trail, following what appeared to be a game path worn by deer or elk. The creature moved with purpose, heading downhill toward a series of ravines that cut through the mountainside like scars. "It's taking her somewhere specific," Marco murmured, pausing to examine a broken sapling. "Not just running." The knowledge was both comforting and terrifying. If the creature had a destination in mind, it might not harm Isabel immediately, but it also meant it had plans for her. Plans I couldn't begin to comprehend and didn't want to imagine. We followed the tracks to a dry creek bed, the ground littered with smooth stones polished by long-gone water. Here, Marco lost the trail briefly, the hard ground refusing to hold prints. We cast about frantically, searching for any sign of which way they had gone. "There," I said, pointing to a scrap of fabric caught on a thorny bush, the same blue as Isabel's windbreaker, and beside it, half hidden under a fallen leaf, lay her camera strap, torn and dirty, the lens cracked. My stomach folded in on itself. Marco's face tightened, his mustache twitching like a scared animal. He muttered a prayer in Spanish I hadn't heard since our mother's funeral, the words carrying a desperate plea for protection. We pushed on, following more torn bits of clothing, disturbed earth, broken vegetation. The ravine deepened, its walls rising around us like the sides of a grave. The air grew noticeably cooler, heavy with the smell of wet stone and something else, something rotten and musky that caught in the back of my throat. "We're getting close to its den," Marco said, his voice barely audible. Fear washed over me in a cold wave. If we found the creature's lair, what would we find inside? I thought of the elk carcass, systematically dismembered, of Gerald Thompson's blood-stained backpack, of Isabel, small and fragile against the immensity of that thing's hunger. But there was no question of turning back. If there was even the slightest chance Isabel was still alive, we had to continue. And if she wasn't, then I wanted the satisfaction of putting a bullet through the brain of the thing that had taken her. The ravine widened into a small box canyon, its floor covered in dead leaves and scattered bones, mostly animal but some disturbingly human-like. At the far end, a dark opening yawned in the rock face. A cave, its entrance partially hidden by a fallen tree. We approached cautiously, every sense alert for danger. The musky smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming. Something lived in that cave. Something that fed regularly and well. I was about to suggest we approach from opposite sides when movement caught my eye. A small form curled beneath a fallen aspen about 20 yards to our right. A flash of pink t-shirt, dark hair. Isabel, I breathed, scarcely daring to hope. Marco had seen her too, and was already moving, shotgun aimed at the cave entrance to cover me as I sprinted toward my daughter. I reached her in seconds, dropping to my knees beside her huddled form. Isabel, Mija, it's Dad. I'm here. She uncurled slowly, eyes huge and wet and a face pale with terror. I knelt, pulled her out from under the aspen's protective branches. She shook so hard her teeth clicked, but she was alive, unharmed from what I could see. Tall dog, she whispered, the only word she seemed capable of forming. Tall dog. I gathered her into my arms, her small body feeling impossibly fragile against mine. She clung to me, fingers digging into my shoulders with desperate strength. I've got you, I murmured into her hair. I've got you. You're safe now. But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. None of us were safe, not while that thing was still out there. And judging by the freshness of the spoor around the cave entrance, it hadn't gone far. We need to move, Marco urged, eyes still fixed on the cave. Now, before it comes back. I nodded, gathering Isabel closer. Can you walk, Misha? She nodded against my chest, though I wasn't convinced. Her legs, when she tried to stand, wobbled dangerously beneath her. Without hesitation, I scooped her up, cradling her against my chest as I had when she was a toddler. She was heavier now, but fear and adrenaline made her weight insignificant. We formed a triangle, weapons outward, and moved, Marco leading, me carrying Isabel in the middle, constantly scanning our surroundings for any sign of the creature's return. The ravine seemed longer on the way out, the climb back to the game trail steeper. Isabel's weight began to tell on my arms and back, but I refused to put her down, terrified that if I let go of her for even a moment, she would vanish again. Shadows lengthened as afternoon slid toward evening. The forest took on the golden hue of late day, deceptively peaceful. Every snap of twig sounded deliberate, stalking us just beyond what the eye could grasp. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed for flight, but running invites pursuit. So we walked, slow and steady, Marco's training keeping us to a sustainable pace. Isabel had stopped shaking, but she remained silent, face buried against my shoulder. Whatever she had seen, whatever had happened during her captivity, had affected her deeply. I found myself hoping she wouldn't remember, even as I knew that was unlikely. Some horrors carved themselves too deeply to be forgotten. We were about halfway back to the RV, the trail finally visible ahead, when the thing stepped onto the path. 8, maybe 9 feet high, it stood on legs bent backward at the knee, torso lean like a marathoner's but wound with ropey muscle that shifted beneath patchy fur. The fur, charcoal and patchy, clung to the shoulders and haunches but left much of the torso bare, revealing grayish skin stretched over an anatomy that was almost but not quite human. Arms longer than a man's hung at its sides, ending in hands that could close over my entire skull, tipped with curved claws that looked capable of gutting a bear. But it was the head that froze the breath in my lungs. Unmistakably canine, but wrong. All wrong. The muzzle sat askew, as if broken and healed badly, scarred white where flesh never grew back. One ear hung in tatters, the other stood erect, swiveling, gauging distance, and the eyes. Yellow, glassy, intelligent, assessing. Not animal eyes, though not human either. Something in between. Something that understood cruelty and enjoyed it. It stood perfectly still, watching us with those terrible eyes, the only movement the slight rise and fall of its chest as it breathed. In, out, unhurried, confident. Isabel made a small broken sound against my chest. I tightened my grip on her, my other hand raising the rifle despite the awkwardness of the position. Marco had already leveled his shotgun, his stance solid, hand steady despite what must have been overwhelming fear. For a long moment, we stood frozen in tableau, the creature blocking the path ahead. Marco and I with our weapons raised, Isabel trembling in my arms. The silence stretched, broken only by our ragged breathing and the distant call of a crow, oblivious to the drama unfolding below. Then the creature smiled. There's no other word for it. Its ruined muzzle pulled back, revealing yellowed fangs in a grotesque parody of human expression. The message was clear. It was toying with us. We were not prey that had escaped. We were prey that had been released, allowed to believe in the possibility of escape. before being reminded of our true position. It dropped to all fours and sprinted. The movement was so sudden, so explosively fast, that I barely had time to raise my rifle before it was halfway to us. I fired. The first round punched into its ribcage, popped hair in a mist of dark. It staggered but never slowed, the wound seeming to anger rather than weaken it. Marco let off both shotgun barrels. Buckshot patterned the creature's chest. More dark spray, but still it came. Momentum undiminished. If anything, the wound seemed to fuel its rage, its yellow eyes blazing with hateful intensity. The beast veered, crashed shoulder first into a ponderosa pine. Bark flew, the entire tree shuddering with the impact. For a heartbeat, I thought it had injured itself, bought us precious seconds, but it was just changing tactics, redirecting its charge to circle around Marco's position. I jammed another magazine home, firing until the bolt clicked on empty. At least 3 rounds hit home. I saw the impacts, saw flesh tear and dark blood spray, but the creature barely slowed. It was as if we were shooting at a freight train, our bullets mere annoyances against its mass and momentum. "Run!" Marco shouted, reloading his shotgun with practiced efficiency. "Get Isabel out of here." I hesitated, unwilling to leave him facing that thing alone. But Isabel's safety had to come first. Marco and I were in agreement on that, had always been. "Go!" he bellowed, and this time I obeyed, turning to sprint toward the RV with Isabel clutched against my chest. Behind me, Marco fired again, the shotgun's roar followed by an inhuman shriek of pain or rage. Impossible to tell which. I didn't look back, focusing instead on the path ahead, on the increasingly leaden weight of Isabel in my arms, on the burning in my lungs as I pushed my body beyond its limits. Isabel screamed my name, the sound piercing even through the fog of exertion. The warning pulled me sideways enough that the thing's claws, curved like sickles, merely raked my left forearm instead of disemboweling me as intended. Heat bloomed along the wound, wet and sticky. I was bleeding, though adrenaline kept the pain at bay for now. I tumbled, somehow managing to twist so that Isabel landed on top of me, rather than beneath. My rifle skittered out of reach, useless now. I scrambled to my feet, pushing Isabel behind me as the creature circled, its movements almost lazy now, enjoying our fear. Then Marco was there, vaulting over a fallen log, swinging his Remington like a club. Steel met snout with a dull crack. The beast recoiled, teeth flashing under the moon's first silver glow as it snarled in surprised pain. "Run to the truck!" I barked at Isabel. "Now!" No thought, pure reflex. We bolted, Isabel first, me bleeding after her, Marco guarding the rear. The creature followed, silent but thunderous in impact, trees shaking as it careened through the underbrush. I felt rather than saw it pacing our flank, probing for angles of attack, toying with us as a cat toys with mice. The Winnebago was visible now, its white bulk reflecting the last of the daylight. 30 yards, 25. We might make it. We might actually make it. The beast had other ideas. It sprang sideways, cutting across the clearing, intercepting our path with terrifying intelligence. It knew where we were heading and had calculated the shortest route to cut us off. This wasn't mindless predation, this was strategy. Marco shoved Isabel toward the RV, then turned, planting himself between the creature and us. He raised the shotgun, but the thing swept his legs with one fluid swing of its massive arm. Bones snapped, the sound like dry ice cracking, and Marco hit the ground screaming, weapon flying from his grasp. I reached the RV ladder, pushed Isabel up, yelled at her to get inside and lock the cab. She obeyed, eyes wild but clear, her instinct for survival overriding her terror. I spun, snatched a flare from my belt, sparked it. Magenta fire leapt, spitting sparks. I hurled it at the beast's face. It recoiled, pawing at the sizzling embers clinging to its fur. The momentary distraction gave me the seconds I needed. I grabbed Marco under the armpits and dragged him toward the RV, his broken leg trailing uselessly. He bit his forearm to keep from shouting, veins bulging with the effort of containing his pain. We made the door. Isabel yanked us in and slammed the compromised panel home, wedging it with the fire extinguisher. The beast hit the side hard, the whole RV rocked, cabinets dumped plates. Isabel shrieked as glass shattered around us. I scrambled to the driver's seat, keys already in the ignition. Thank God for that small mercy. The engine coughed, caught. Headlights poured white over a sheet of fur in front of the windshield. The creature reared, paws slapping glass, spider webbing cracks across the windshield. I jammed the throttle. The RV lurched, smacked the beast with a hollow thud, then ground forward, wheels spitting gravel. For 50 yards I kept my foot welded to the pedal, willing the ancient vehicle to move faster, to carry us away from the nightmare behind us. Then the rear axle lifted, weight on the bumper. The beast had hauled itself onto the ladder, claws screeching over metal toward the roof. Isabel screamed, pointing upward as the ceiling dented inward from the creature's weight. I saw a dead spruce ahead, trunk wide as a stove. At 50 miles an hour in that old rig, impact would be devastating. But if I didn't do something drastic, we weren't going to make it out of these mountains alive. I aimed for the tree, bracing myself as best I could. The impact hammered us sideways, the Winnebago groaning as metal tore and glass shattered. Something heavy flew off the roof, thudded into underbrush. The RV skidded, tires smoking, but miraculously stayed upright. Silence settled, ragged and thin. I glanced back at Marco, who lay pale and sweating on the floor, his leg bent at an angle that made my stomach churn. Isabel crouched beside him, her small hand on his forehead in a gesture of comfort that broke my heart. "Is it gone?" she whispered. Before I could answer, a screech of dorsal metal answered for me. The roof vent ripped away, and an arm snaked through, feeling for purchase. Yellow eyes peered over the edge, fixing on Isabel in the passenger seat. The creature had survived the impact, its determination to reach us undiminished. Marco, pale from blood loss, raised the Remington one-handed. He must have recovered it during our flight. The blast roared, filling the cabin with powder haze. The arm yanked back, wrist dangling by threads of sinew and skin. The beast dropped behind us, rolling, then vanished into the gathering darkness. Whether it was finally injured enough to retreat or simply regrouping for another attack, I didn't wait to find out. I gunned the engine again, the damaged RV protesting but moving, carrying us away from that place of shadows and teeth. I drove until asphalt appeared, until the ranger station lights broke through the dark like a promise of safety. We spilled out, blood on our clothes, Marco on a stretcher inside 5 minutes, Isabel wrapped in a shock blanket, me tied tight with gauze around my lacerated arm. The rangers were professional, efficient, asking few questions beyond the immediate necessities. I caught the look that passed between two of them when I mentioned a creature attack. Skepticism tinged with concern for our mental state. They'd heard stories like ours before, I realized, and they had their official explanation ready. Rogue bear, possibly rabid wolf, mountain lion protecting territory. But they followed us to the campsite at first light. They found the prints, the elk carcass, the clawed door of the cabin, the shredded vent of the RV. They photographed everything, took samples of the dark fluid that might have been the creature's blood, and they spoke in clipped voices about an aggressive predator, about relocation orders and hunting permits. They never once made me feel wrong about what we'd seen. But neither did they acknowledge the truth of it, that what had hunted us through those mountains wasn't anything recognized by science, wasn't anything that should exist in a rational world. I didn't press the point. What would have been the use? The rangers had their reports to file, their superiors to satisfy, and I had a traumatized daughter and an injured brother to care for. The truth could wait, maybe forever. I paid cash to have the Winnebago scrapped that week. The rental company wasn't happy, but their insurance covered it, and I couldn't bear the thought of ever seeing that vehicle again, with its torn roof and blood-spattered interior. Some things you don't repair. You discard them and try to forget they ever existed. Marco spent 3 weeks in the hospital. His right femur had been fractured in 2 places, requiring surgical pins and a steel rod to stabilize. The doctors marveled at the bear's strength, at the precision of the break. When they asked for details of the attack, Marco gave them the sanitized version we'd agreed upon, a large predator, possibly a grizzly, though we hadn't gotten a good look at it. The lie tasted bitter, but what was the alternative? To speak of 9-foot wolf men with near-human intelligence, to describe yellow eyes that understood cruelty. We'd be dismissed as trauma victims, our testimony discredited, and if others ventured into those mountains unprepared for what lurked there, that would be on us. So we kept the truth between us, a burden shared but undiminished. Isabel didn't speak for 2 days after we returned to Denver. When she finally did, it was to ask if the tall dog could find us in the city. I told her no, that creatures like that stayed in the deep wilderness, far from human habitation. I had no evidence for this, just a desperate hope and a father's need to reassure his child. She seemed to accept it, or at least to recognize my need for her to accept it. The nightmares began the following week. Isabel would wake screaming, thrashing against invisible restraints, eyes wide but unseeing. It took sometimes an hour to calm her, to convince her she was safe, that the tall dog couldn't reach her here. During the day she jumped at shadows, flinched at sudden movements, loud noises, a car backfiring, a door slamming, could send her into a state of paralyzed terror. The child psychologist we consulted diagnosed PTSD. No surprise there. She recommended a regimen of therapy, possibly medication if the symptoms didn't improve. She also suggested that Isabel take up an activity that would help her feel more in control. more capable of defending herself. So Isabel began taking judo classes. The physical discipline seemed to help center her, to give her a framework for managing her fear. The nightmares didn't stop, but they became less frequent, less intense. She still wouldn't go near parks or wooded areas, still kept a flashlight by her bed, but she was functioning, healing, in her way. Marco walks with a steel rod in his leg now, a slight limp that becomes more pronounced when he's tired or the weather changes. He moved in with us after being released from the hospital, converting my home office into a bedroom. Neither of us said it aloud, but we both recognized the need to stay close, to maintain the protective triangle we'd formed in those mountains. He still wakes shouting sometimes, his combat PTSD now compounded by fresh trauma. On those nights I find him in the kitchen, cleaning his shotgun by the dim light over the stove. We sit together in silence. The ritual of weapon maintenance a kind of meditation for him, a way of asserting control over the uncontrollable. As for me, I traded wildlife photography for indoor studio work. The thought of returning to those mountains, of pointing my camera into shadows that might contain yellow eyes and sharp teeth, is unbearable. I've become an expert in still lifes, in carefully controlled lighting and composition. My new work lacks the wild beauty of my nature photography, but it's precise, technical, safe. And every trail map in my house carries a thick red X across Colorado's White River National Forest, and no one will ever talk me into erasing it. But the worst part isn't the nightmares, or the changes to our lives, or even the constant undercurrent of fear. The worst part is the not knowing what that thing was, where it came from, how many more like it might exist in the remote corners of wilderness. Not knowing if it's still out there, hunting other hikers, other families who venture too far from the marked trails. Sometimes I scan local news reports for missing hikers, for animal attacks in Colorado's backcountry. I've started a file, dates, locations, descriptions of what was found and what wasn't. There's a pattern there, faint but discernible. Clusters of disappearances every few years, always in the same general region, always during the late summer or early fall, always described officially as tragic accidents or presumed bear attacks. I've thought about going public with what we saw, what we know. But who would believe us, and what would it accomplish, beyond branding us as lunatics, perhaps causing Isabel to be taken from me by well-meaning social services concerned about her mental environment? So I keep silent. We all do. We've rebuilt our lives around the hollow space that experience carved in us, adapted to living with the knowledge that the world is not what most people believe it to be, that the darkness contains things with teeth and intelligence and malice, that survival sometimes means accepting wounds that never fully heal. Last week, Isabel asked me if we could go camping this summer. Not in the mountains, she clarified quickly, seeing my expression, but maybe at one of the state parks, with their well-maintained campgrounds and ranger stations and crowds of other people. The safe kind of wilderness, sanitized and surveilled. I wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed against it, but her eyes held a tentative hope, a testing of boundaries, and I recognized it for what it was, a step toward reclaiming something that had been taken from her. Her fearlessness, her love of nature, her belief in her own safety in the world. Things no child should lose, certainly not at 12. We'll see, I told her, which in parent speak usually means no. But maybe, just maybe, this time it means what it says. We'll see, we'll try. We'll attempt to find our way back to some version of the people we were before, because the alternative is to let that thing win, to let it continue hunting us long after we escaped its forest, its claws, its hunger, to surrender not just our bodies but our spirits to the fear it planted in us, and I refuse to give it that satisfaction. So we'll see. We'll take small steps back toward the light, toward normalcy. We'll tell ourselves that what happened in White River National Forest was an aberration, a nightmare intersection of our path with something ancient and awful that usually keeps to deeper shadows. We'll pretend to believe it, and maybe someday we actually will. But every trail map in my house will continue to carry that thick red X across Colorado, and no one, not even Isabel, will ever talk me into erasing it. Some boundaries once crossed cannot be uncrossed. Some knowledge once gained cannot be unlearned. Some wounds once opened can only be managed, never truly healed. My name is David Salazar, and this happened to me back in 2017 in the White River National Forest, Colorado. I've written it down now, as my therapist suggested, though I doubt it will help. Some horrors aren't exorcised by being named. They're only given stronger shape, more persistent form. But if you're reading this, and if you're planning a hiking trip to Colorado's backcountry, stay on the marked trails. Don't venture up to abandoned firewatch cabins, no matter how interesting they might seem on old maps. Don't dismiss strange tracks or inexplicable animal remains, And if the forest goes suddenly, completely silent around you, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, and don't look back, because there are things in this world that science hasn't cataloged, that reason can't explain. Things that stand 9 feet tall on backward-bending legs, with yellow eyes that understand cruelty. Things that hunt not just for food but for sport, for the pleasure of fear. Things with just enough humanity to make their monstrousness all the more terrifying. And they're hungry. Always hungry. For flesh, yes, but even more for fear. For the particular flavor of terror that only comes when prey recognizes its true position in the food chain. When it realizes that all its technology, all its civilization, all its assumed dominance counts for nothing against teeth and claws and ancient hunger. I know this now. Marco knows it. Isabel knows it, though we try to help her forget. And somewhere in the White River National Forest, padding silently through pine shadows on massive paws, something knows that we know. Something remembers our scent, our taste, the particular timbre of our screams. Something waits, patient as only a perfect predator can be, for the day we make the mistake of returning to its territory. But we won't. Some lessons, once learned, cannot be unlearned. Some fears, once faced, should never be faced again. Stay on the trails, stay safe, stay human, and if you hear something in the forest that sounds almost like language but contains no words, run. Run, and don't stop running until you reach asphalt and electric light and the comforting illusion that you stand at the top of the food chain, because you don't. We never did. And the sooner you accept that truth, the better your chances of survival. My name is Dakota Blackfeather. I inherited this name from my grandmother, who was Lakota Sioux, though I grew up in a small apartment in Minneapolis, disconnected from those roots. The name means friend to everyone in Lakota. What bitter irony that would become. After 3 years working at a tech startup that went under during the economic downturn, I was left with mounting debt and diminishing prospects. My studio apartment in uptown Minneapolis felt like it was shrinking daily, walls closing in with each past due notice that arrived. I needed an escape, something to clear my head before starting the grueling job search again. That's when I remembered my uncle's hunting cabin in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota. He'd left it to me when he passed 2 summers ago, but I'd never visited. Too busy chasing that elusive promotion that would never materialize. The cabin was off-grid, solar panels for minimal power, a hand pump for well water, and enough isolation to finally hear myself think. The property taxes were minimal, and I'd avoided selling it out of some vague sentimentality. I packed my weathered Subaru with camping supplies, my grandfather's old hunting rifle, though I'd never hunted, and enough food for 2 weeks. The drive north took nearly 6 hours, the landscape gradually transforming from suburban sprawl to dense pine forest that seemed to swallow the winding road. The cabin was more rustic than I'd imagined, a single-room structure with a small loft, a wood stove for heat, and windows clouded with years of dust. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the closest town, a place called Moose Lake, was a 40-minute drive on rough forest roads. That first night I sat on the weathered porch listening to the forest. The sounds were different than the city, deeper, older somehow. I'd always loved science fiction books and survival shows, fancying myself capable in the wilderness despite my urban upbringing. Now I would test that theory. I found my uncle's journal in a drawer beside the bed. His handwriting was cramped but legible, detailing hunting trips and weather patterns. The final entries were strange, though. Rambling descriptions of something watching from the tree line. "It wears their faces," one entry read. "Don't trust what you see." I dismissed it as the confused writings of an elderly man. Uncle James had been in his 80s, after all. Probably the onset of dementia. Still, reading it in the flickering light of the kerosene lamp, I couldn't help glancing toward the windows, seeing only my reflection against the oppressive darkness beyond. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching at the door. Probably raccoons or a curious deer, I told myself. But when I checked the porch in the morning, I found strange markings carved into the wooden railing, symbols I didn't recognize, curved lines and angular shapes that seemed deliberate. A joke from local teens, maybe? But who knew I was here? I hadn't told anyone where I was going. Hadn't had anyone to tell. I tried to laugh it off, but the symbols nagged at me. Familiar somehow, like something I'd seen in one of my grandmother's old books. I decided to hike to the nearby lake that day. The forest was thick with ancient pines and paper birch, their trunks like pale ghosts among the shadows. The path was barely visible, more suggestion than trail. I found myself checking over my shoulder repeatedly, unable to shake the feeling of being observed. The lake, when I reached it, was breathtaking. Crystal clear water reflecting the cloudless sky. But something about the stillness unsettled me. No birds called. No fish jumped. The silence was absolute, pressing against my ears like cotton wool. That's when I saw the tracks along the muddy shore. Not animal, not human, but something in between. Too large for a wolf, too narrow for a bear, with strange elongated digits that dug deep into the soft earth. They led into the water and didn't emerge on the other side. As the sun began to sink, I hurried back to the cabin, unable to escape the weight of unseen eyes following my retreat. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by isolation and my uncle's disturbing journal. But deep down, some ancestral part of me knew better. The second day at the cabin started with uneasy dreams and stiffness in my bones that spoke of city living. I made coffee on the propane stove, grimacing at the bitter grounds I'd forgotten to pack my preferred medium roast in my rush to escape Minneapolis. Through the kitchen window, the forest appeared benign in the morning light, almost welcoming. I spent the morning cleaning the cabin, discovering layers of dust covering my uncle's possessions. A collection of dried herbs hung from ceiling rafters, sage, sweetgrass, and others I couldn't identify. Grandmother would have known. She'd tried teaching me about medicines and protection rituals when I was young, but I'd been more interested in video games and science fiction. In a trunk beneath the bed, I found an old leather pouch containing what looked like a medicine bundle. Feathers, small stones, and a piece of antler wrapped in red cloth. A chill ran through me as I recognized the symbols on the cloth, the same ones carved into the porch railing. I replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, some instinct warning against disturbing these items further. After lunch, I decided to gather firewood. The temperature was dropping, and the forecast I'd checked before losing cell service predicted rain. The forest floor was carpeted with pine needles that muffled my footsteps as I collected fallen branches. The trees grew denser the further I ventured from the cabin, their canopy blocking most of the sunlight. That's when I first noticed the silence. The forest had gone completely still. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, nothing but my own breathing. I straightened, arms full of firewood, and scanned my surroundings. Nothing moved, yet the sensation of being watched intensified. A branch snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, dropping several sticks. Nothing visible, just more trees and shadows. But the air had changed, become heavier somehow, charged with anticipation. "Hello?" My voice sounded thin and artificial. "Someone there?" Nothing answered except a distant raven's call that somehow made the silence afterward more profound. I gathered what wood I could carry and hurried back to the cabin, unable to shake the crawling sensation between my shoulder blades. As I stacked the wood beside the stove, I noticed mud on the cabin floor, footprints that weren't mine, leading from the door to the kitchen and then vanishing. I checked every corner of the cabin, even the small storage crawl space, finding nothing. The door had been locked from the inside. The windows were intact. Yet someone, or something, had been here while I was gathering wood. That evening, as dusk gathered, I sat with my grandfather's rifle across my lap, watching the tree line through the window. The wind had picked up, bending the pines and carrying what sounded like whispers, my name perhaps, or just the random noise of branches scraping together. Rain began to fall around midnight, drumming against the roof. I must have dozed off because I jerked awake suddenly, disoriented. The cabin was dark, the solar-powered lights had failed. Outside, the rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the eaves, creating a syncopated rhythm against the porch. Tap, tap, tappa, tap. No, not water. Knocking. I fumbled for my flashlight, pointing it toward the door. The knocking stopped immediately. Heart pounding, I approached the window, keeping to the side to avoid being silhouetted. The porch appeared empty, but something moved at the edge of the woods. A figure, tall and unnaturally thin, standing perfectly still among the trees. I raised the flashlight, but by the time the beam reached the spot, nothing was there. Sleep was impossible after that. I built up the fire in the stove and sat with my back to the wall, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. I found myself wishing I'd paid more attention to my grandmother's stories, especially the ones about the wilderness and its dangers. Near dawn, exhaustion finally claimed me. I dreamed of running through endless forest, pursued by something that wore a parade of familiar faces. My boss, my ex-girlfriend, my late uncle, all with eyes too dark and smiles too wide. I woke to find fresh symbols carved into the inside of the cabin door. From the inside, the morning of the third day brought heavy fog that clung to the treetops and filtered through the forest like ghostly fingers. I examined the new symbols on the cabin door in the gray daylight. They formed a crude circle with lines radiating outward like a child's drawing of the sun. But something about them raised the hair on my arms. They weren't carved with a knife but appeared burned into the wood, the edges blackened and curled. After a nearly sleepless night, my nerves were frayed. I needed to go into town for supplies and maybe ask locals about the symbols. The drive to Moose Lake was tense, the fog limiting visibility to mere yards ahead. Twice I thought I saw someone standing along the roadside, but when I slowed there was nothing but twisted stumps or shadow-draped boulders. Moose Lake was barely a town, a gas station with a small grocery section, a diner, and a handful of houses clustered around a crossroads. At the diner I ordered coffee and eggs, desperate for human contact. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with leathery skin and sharp eyes, studied me as she poured the coffee. "Staying at the old Blackfeather place?" she asked, surprising me. "Not many come through here don't live nearby." "It was my uncle's," I explained. "I'm taking some time off work." She nodded slowly. James was a good man. Knew things most folks forget these days. She hesitated. "You going back up there tonight?" "That's the plan," I said, unsettled by her concern. "Full moon tonight," she said, as if that explained everything. "Keep to the cabin after dark. Some things in those woods don't take kindly to outsiders." I almost asked her about the symbols, but stopped myself. Something about her expression warned against further questions. Instead, I finished my meal in silence, paid, and headed to the small grocery section of the gas station. The teenage clerk barely looked up from his phone as I gathered supplies. On impulse, I picked up a local newspaper. The headline caught my eye. "Third hiker missing in Boundary Waters area." According to the article, 3 solo hikers had disappeared in the last month, all within 20 miles of where my cabin stood. Search parties had found nothing except one abandoned campsite with, as the paper described it, unusual markings on surrounding trees. The drive back to the cabin seemed longer, the forest pressing closer. I kept the radio on, tuned to the only station that came through clearly. Some religious programming that faded in and out with bursts of static. Ancient evil that walks between. Static. Wears the skin of those it. More static. Pray for protection from the... I switched it off, preferring silence to the unsettling fragments. The fog had lifted somewhat by the time I reached the cabin, but darkness was falling quickly. I hurried inside with my supplies, securing the door with a chair propped under the handle. Around midnight, the full moon broke through the clouds, casting silver-blue light through the windows. I sat at the small table, reading through more of my uncle's journal, looking for clues about the symbols. The final pages were increasingly paranoid, describing a thin one that watched from the trees and spoke with the voices of the dead. Uncle James wrote about hearing his late wife calling to him from the forest, begging him to come outside. A sharp crack from outside interrupted my reading, the sound of a large branch breaking under weight, then another. Something heavy was moving through the undergrowth, toward the cabin. I grabbed my rifle, checking that it was loaded. The footsteps, if that's what they were, circled the cabin slowly. Then, silence. "Dakota?" My blood froze. It was my grandmother's voice, exactly as I remembered from childhood. The slight accent, the way she softened certain consonants. "Dakota, please help me. I'm hurt out here." I knew it was impossible. My grandmother had died 5 years ago. I'd attended her funeral, seen her buried. This was some cruel trick, yet the voice continued, growing more desperate. "Please, grandson. Something's following me. Let me in." I remained motionless, rifle aimed at the door, sweat beading on my forehead, despite the chill. "Dakota, why won't you help me? Don't you love your grandmother?" The voice changed then, transforming mid-sentence from my grandmother's gentle tones to something else. Multiple voices layered together, some high and childlike, others deep and guttural, all speaking in unison. "We see you, Dakota Blackfeather. We wear your blood. We know your fear." Something heavy slammed against the door, rattling it in its frame. The chair holding it shut jumped but held. 3 more impacts followed, each stronger than the last. On the 4th, the chair splintered. I fired a warning shot through the window into the air. The assault stopped immediately. For long minutes nothing moved. Then came a scraping sound from the roof. Slow, deliberate movements of something large crossing overhead. Dust and debris rained down as the old timber creaked under the weight. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally came, I found deep gouges in the porch and door, marks made by claws or tools I couldn't identify. And hanging from the porch railing was a small, freshly made medicine bundle identical to the one in my uncle's trunk. Someone was trying to tell me something, or warn me. By the 4th day, exhaustion had become my constant companion. I moved through the cabin in a haze, jumping at shadows and the normal creaks of the aging structure. The medicine bundle left on the porch troubled me most, a perfect replica of my uncle's, down to the red cloth with mysterious symbols. I spent the morning comparing the 2 bundles side by side on the kitchen table. The new one contained a hawk feather, a smooth river stone, and a small piece of what appeared to be dried meat wrapped in the symbol-covered cloth. My hands trembled as I examined it, some deep instinct warning against touching the contents directly. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. Protection medicine is strongest when given, not taken. Had someone left this for me? Or was it a more sinister message? Around noon, I decided to explore the perimeter of the property, hoping daylight would provide some security. The forest surrounding the cabin covered about 5 acres before meeting a natural boundary, a steep ravine to the east, the lake to the north, and denser forest to the south and west. Near the ravine edge, I found the first sign, a circle of stones with more symbols scratched into the exposed earth within. The arrangement seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. As I leaned closer to examine the markings, a sharp pain lanced through my temple, accompanied by whispered words I couldn't quite understand. I stepped back quickly, and the whispers faded. This was no teenage prank. The circle was part of something older, something that resonated with the little I remembered from my grandmother's teachings. Moving along the property line, I found 4 more stone circles at roughly equal distances, forming a pentagon with the cabin at its center. Each circle contained different symbols, and each triggered that same painful response when I approached too closely. Whispers and pressure behind my eyes, like memories trying to surface. The last circle, near the lakeshore, was different. The stones were arranged in a spiral pattern, and at its center lay a small animal skull. A fox, I thought, though something about its proportions seemed wrong. Too elongated, the eye sockets too large. As I stood contemplating the spiral, movement on the opposite shore caught my attention. A figure stood at the water's edge, tall and motionless. The distance was too great to make out details, but something about its stillness made my skin crawl. No human stands that perfectly still. I raised a hand in greeting, more out of instinct than any desire to communicate. The figure mirrored my gesture with a jerky, unnatural movement. "Hello?" I called across the water, my voice sounding small against the vastness of the wilderness. No verbal response came, but the figure took a single step forward, into the lake, then another. It was walking into the water with deliberate steps, never breaking stride even as the water reached its waist, then chest. I watched, transfixed with horror, as it disappeared completely beneath the surface. I waited for it to emerge, to continue crossing the lake, but the water returned to its glassy stillness as if nothing had disturbed it. I backed away from the shore, then turned and ran to the cabin, my heart hammering against my ribs. Inside, I double-checked all locks and windows, then retrieved both medicine bundles and placed them on either side of the door, some half-remembered protection ritual my grandmother once showed me. As afternoon faded to evening, clouds gathered, obscuring the moon. The forest grew darker than I'd ever seen it, a darkness that seemed to have substance, pressing against the windows like a living thing. I tried distracting myself by reading more of my uncle's journal, searching for answers. The final entry gave me pause. It cannot cross running water on its own. It needs invitation or a vessel. The circles hold it back, but the circles are breaking. If you're reading this and I'm gone, forgive me. It may have taken my face by now. A cold certainty settled in my stomach. Whatever was out there had been stalking my uncle before his death. Now it had found me. Around midnight, as wind lashed rain against the cabin, I heard splashing from the direction of the lake. Heavy, deliberate footsteps sloshing through water and mud. Approaching the cabin, I sat with my rifle across my knees, staring at the door, wondering if the crude protection I'd arranged would hold against what was coming. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the porch, then came the knocking. 3 slow, heavy blows that resonated through the cabin, and a voice, my uncle's voice, called my name. "Dakota, open up. It's raining something fierce out here." My uncle's voice was exactly as I remembered it, gruff but kind, with that slight northern Minnesota accent. I kept the rifle trained on the door, my finger alongside the trigger guard. "You're not my uncle," I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "James Blackfeather died 2 years ago." A pause, then laughter, dry and brittle like dead leaves scraping across pavement. "Smart boy. Smarter than your uncle was." The voice had changed, no longer my uncle's, but something hollow and multi-toned. "But you'll open the door eventually. They all do." "What are you?" I demanded. Another pause. I could hear breathing on the other side of the door. Wet, labored breathing that didn't sound fully human. "I've worn many names," it finally answered. "Your grandmother's people called me Wendigo. Others use different words. Names have power, but not over me." The hair on my arms stood on end. Grandmother had told stories of the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that possessed humans, driving them to cannibalism and madness. But this didn't feel like the same creature from her tales. "You're lying," I said. "The Wendigo is born of starvation and winter. This is summer." A low chuckle came through the door. So certain of old stories? There are older hungers than for flesh, deeper winters than snow. I am the hunger that walks. I am the cold between stars. Something scrape against the cabin wall. Long, dragging sounds like claws or fingernails scoring the wood. I've tasted your family before, Dakota Blackfeather. Your uncle was stringy but sweet. His memories led me to you. My stomach clenched. Uncle James had died of a heart attack while hunting, according to the authorities. His body had been found a week later, partially disturbed by wildlife. You're afraid now, the thing outside continued. Good. Fear seasons the meat. The scraping moved around the cabin to the window. I swiveled, raising the rifle. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could see a shape. Humanoid, but wrong. Limbs too long. Joints bending in impossible directions. Its face was obscured by darkness, but something pale gleamed where its eyes should be. I can wear any face you love, it said. Voice now coming from the window. Would you prefer your grandmother? Your mother? That girlfriend who left you for the banker? As it spoke, the shape shifted subtly, its outline blurring and reforming. I fired a shot through the window, shattering the glass. The figure jerked back, then let out a sound between a laugh and a screech. Iron and lead cannot harm me, child of dust. But it had retreated from the window. I used the moment to grab my phone, desperate for connection to the outside world. No signal, as expected. But I opened the camera and began recording, determined to document whatever happened next. Outside, the thing circled back to the door. The medicine bundles I'd placed there began to smoke, emitting an acrid smell that filled the cabin. The smoke formed strange patterns in the air, the same symbols from the bundles and stone circles, glowing faintly blue in the darkness. Old magic, the creature hissed, its voice now pained. It will not save you. The circles are broken. The old woman who maintained them is gone. Realization struck me. The waitress in town? I whispered. Smart boy, it repeated. She tried to warn you, didn't she? Too little, too late. The door began to bulge inward, wood creaking under impossible pressure. The smoking bundles flared brighter, and the thing outside screeched in what sounded like pain. The pressure on the door ceased. For hours it circled the cabin, testing boundaries, sometimes speaking with familiar voices, sometimes making sounds no human throat could produce. The medicine bundles continued burning, never quite consuming their contents, filling the cabin with protective smoke. Near dawn, the assault stopped abruptly. Through the broken window came the sound of multiple voices chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The creature outside let out a furious howl that faded into the distance, as if it were being driven away. Cautiously, I approached the window and peered out. The rain had stopped, and in the gray pre-dawn light, I could see 5 figures standing in a circle around the cabin. Men and women wearing ordinary clothes but holding what appeared to be similar medicine bundles. The waitress from the diner stood among them, her eyes meeting mine through the shattered glass. Dawn comes, but it will return tonight, she called to me. We cannot hold it back again. You need to leave this place, Dakota Blackfeather, today. Before I could respond, they turned and walked into the forest, disappearing among the trees as silently as they had come. On the porch steps, illuminated by the growing daylight, lay a freshly killed rabbit. Its belly slit open and its entrails arranged in the shape of a familiar symbol, a warning, or an invitation. The morning after the attack brought eerie calm. Birdsong returned to the forest, and sunlight filtered through the trees as if nothing had happened. I spent the first hours of daylight boarding up the broken window and examining the damage to the cabin. Deep grooves scored the exterior walls, 4 parallel lines repeating in patterns that no animal I knew could make. The dead rabbit remained on the porch steps, its arranged entrails now crawling with ants. I used a shovel to dispose of it in the woods, noting with unease how the forest floor seemed disturbed in a wide circle around the cabin. Undergrowth trampled in spiral patterns mirroring the stone circles I'd found. I should have left immediately, as the waitress advised, but something kept me there, a stubborn curiosity perhaps, or some deeper instinct I couldn't name. This thing had hunted my uncle, now it was hunting me. Running felt like abandoning some unfinished family business. Instead, I spent the day preparing. I gathered the remaining medicine bundles from my uncle's trunk and placed them at strategic points around the cabin. I couldn't read the symbols or understand their meaning, but their arrangement felt right somehow, as if guided by some ancestral memory. In the trunk's false bottom, I discovered a leather-bound book written in a language I didn't recognize, but the hand-drawn illustrations were clear enough. They depicted the creature I'd glimpsed through the window, impossibly thin with elongated limbs and a head that seemed to shift between human and animal features. Beside it were diagrams of the stone circles and symbols I'd found on the property. The final pages contained drawings of a ritual, figures surrounding a central fire, offering something to the flames. The details were unclear, but the intent wasn't. This was a banishing ceremony. As sunset approached, I made my decision. I wouldn't run. I would make my stand. I built a fire in the clearing before the cabin, using wood from an old pine my uncle's journal had specifically mentioned, the lightning-struck sentinel that guards the eastern approach. The wood burned blue-green, giving off acrid smoke that stung my eyes and throat. Around the fire, I arranged items from the medicine bundles in patterns copied from the book. Hawk feathers, river stones, and strips of red cloth bearing hand-drawn symbols. My hands moved with strange confidence, as if they remembered work my mind had forgotten. I cut my palm with my hunting knife, letting blood drip onto the flames. I reclaim this place, I said, the words coming unbidden to my lips. Blood of my blood built here. Blood of my blood defends here. The fire flared higher, smoke twisting into familiar symbols before dispersing into the darkening sky. Night fell like a heavy curtain, stars obscured by gathering clouds. In the distance, thunder rumbled. A summer storm approaching. I waited by the fire, rifle across my knees more for comfort than protection. If the previous night had taught me anything, it was that conventional weapons wouldn't help against what was coming. The attack began differently this time. No footsteps, no voices calling my name. Instead, the forest went completely silent, an unnatural void of sound that pressed against my ears. Even the crackling fire seemed muted, its light dimming though the flames still danced. Movement caught my eye at the forest's edge. Not one figure, but many, standing just beyond the firelight. They stepped forward in unison, and my breath caught as their features became visible. My uncle, my grandmother, my parents. Every significant person from my life stood before me, their faces perfect in detail but their eyes wrong. Solid black, reflecting the firelight like polished obsidian. Blood calls to blood, they spoke in unison, voices layered over each other. You've prepared the way beautifully. I realized too late my mistake. The ritual wasn't for banishing, it was for summoning. I had completed what my uncle had refused to do, what had likely gotten him killed. The creature hadn't killed my uncle out of hunger, but because he'd resisted its influence. What do you want? I managed to ask, my voice thin with fear. Passage, they answered. A door opened cannot be closed. A vessel emptied must be filled. They began circling the fire, moving with fluid grace that no human body could achieve. As they circled, their forms blurred and merged, shapes melting together until only one figure remained, the impossibly tall, thin creature I'd glimpsed through the window. In the firelight I could finally see it clearly. Its skin was tight over an elongated frame, neither fully animal nor human. Its face shifted continuously, features flowing like wax, sometimes resembling my uncle, sometimes my grandmother, sometimes creatures I couldn't name. The old protections are gone, it said, its voice now a chorus contained in one throat. The circles are broken, the boundary thins. I am hunger given form, and you have invited me across. It was right. I had unwittingly completed a ritual begun by others, perhaps generations ago. The stone circles, the symbols, they weren't to keep something out but to keep something in. And I had disrupted them. As it spoke, the fire between us began to change, flames elongating into tendril-like shapes that reached toward me. The smoke thickened, forming a column that twisted into the shape of a door. A darkness within darkness. The skinwalker, for I understood now that's what it truly was, approached the smoke door, its body elongating further as it reached for the threshold. In desperation I recalled my grandmother's final teaching, a story she'd told me on her deathbed that I'd dismissed as fever dreams. Names have power, Dakota. The true name binds, the true name banishes. Remember this when darkness comes. I name you, I shouted, my voice finding strength. I name you Wendigo, Skinwalker, Hunger that walks. The creature paused, its shifting face rippling with what might have been amusement. Names given by men have no power over me, it said. I am older than your words, but its hesitation gave me a moment of clarity. This wasn't about names given, it was about identity claimed. The realization came with certainty that felt like memory. I am Dakota Blackfeather, I declared, stepping forward. This land is mine by blood and bone. You walk here by my invitation and I revoke it. Return to your hunting grounds beyond the water. The fire flared between us, smoke door wavering. The creature let out a sound of frustration and reached for me with impossibly long arms. But where its fingers should have touched my skin, they seemed to meet resistance, an invisible boundary. Blood of the land, it hissed. You've remembered too much. I remember enough, I replied, feeling strength flow through me. My grandmother's strength, my uncle's, generations of Blackfeathers who had maintained the boundaries this thing had tested. The storm broke overhead, rain hissing as it hit the fire. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the clearing in harsh white light. In that instant I saw the creature's true form, ancient beyond reckoning, a hunger given shape by human fear, sustained by human belief. "Return," I commanded again, raising my bleeding palm toward it. With a sound like tearing fabric, the smoke door collapsed, and the creature was pulled backward, its form stretching and distorting until it vanished into the darkness between the trees. The fire extinguished with a final hiss, leaving me alone in the rainy clearing. I stood there until dawn, soaked and shivering but unwilling to move until light returned to the world. As the sun rose, I surveyed the clearing. The symbols I'd arranged were gone, washed away by the rain, but new marks scored the earth, a perfect circle surrounding the fire pit, unaffected by the downpour. The waitress from the diner found me there, standing in the morning light. She didn't seem surprised. "You did well," she said simply. "The boundary holds again, for now." "What was it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer on some level. "Something old," she replied. "Something that hunts in these woods. Something your family has kept at bay for generations." She studied my face. "Will you stay?" to echo to Blackfeather. "These boundaries need tending." I looked at the cabin. My cabin now, truly claimed. Financial problems and job searches seemed distant concerns compared to what I'd experienced, what I now understood about my heritage. "I'll stay," I said, the words feeling right in my mouth. "I'll learn what I need to know." She nodded, satisfied. "Good. The hunger always returns. But so do the guardians." As she turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something familiar in her features, a resemblance to the old photographs of my grandmother's sisters, women I'd never met but whose blood ran in my veins. Family, it seemed, extended further than I'd known, and so did responsibility. That night I began rebuilding the stone circles, guided by instinct and fragmented memories. The forest watched in silence, but it was a different silence now, respectful rather than threatening. Something waited beyond the boundaries, wearing familiar faces and speaking with stolen voices. But the land was mine, claimed in blood and defended in name. For now, that was enough. The hunger would return, but I would be ready.